Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you for another hour of podcasting greatness here on the Sensibly Speaking podcast, brought to you on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and with video here on YouTube. Isn't this awesome? It's only taken me about 6 years to finally start sounding maybe a little bit like a DJ.
Yeah.
So this week, folks, we are talking brainwashing. We're going to get right into this. This is a heady topic. It's a very interesting one, and it is an extremely controversial one. And by controversial, I mean not necessarily with the public at large, but with the folks in law, in legislation, in academia, in government. There's controversy here. There have been statements made in the past about brainwashing. There are academics who say it absolutely does not exist, could not be. People don't, there's no such thing as mind control, blah, blah, blah. We all know, I'm not coming into this, from a neutral, objective point of view. We all know mind control is a thing. Thought reform is a thing. Undue influence is a thing. It's even legally recognized as such. We're going to talk about this stuff, and we're going to talk about it with one of my most favorite podcast guests. We've done a series of podcasts over the years here on my show, and he is always a welcome guest, and I'm sure you guys are going to love this one. Jon Atack, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much, Chris. Lovely to be here.
Awesome, man. So brainwashing. I think the first thing we should do is probably getting right into this. Actually, first, for those of you out there who don't know, let's establish some things. Jon, who are you and why should people listen to you?
I'm a nobody and there's no reason to listen to me.
That's the spirit.
I'm a human being. I was a peripheral member of Scientology for 9 years. I happened to do quite a lot of it. I rose to the high level of operating Thetan level 5. I was a class 2 auditor, a second class auditor, as I like to think of it. Before that, I was a first class auditor, though, so it was class 1. I did the data series, stop laughing. I did the data flunk. I did the data series evaluators course, which nobody was allowed to do. But I somehow never managed to become what's called a total convert, because I wasn't humiliated or abused. I wasn't in the C organization on staff. And the 2 times that people shouted at me, I shouted back. And it meant that when I left, I stood up and said, why is nobody standing up? The dear departed Arnie Lerma said of me, before the internet and safety in numbers, there was Jon Atack. I spent a dozen years helping about 500 people get over their experience in Scientology, worked on 200 media stories around the world in all forms of media, about 150 court cases, and was harassed for 16 years. They went 4 years beyond the point where I stopped because they don't know how to stop. Start, change, stop. I'm stopped. You can leave me alone. But they went on suing me for 4 years after I'd thrown in the towel. I did not sign a silence agreement. I was offered a lifetime salary by a representative of the cult if I would give me monthly payments to be silent, which is the new way of doing it, folks. And I think it has happened to a few people along the way there.
Interesting. That is a new one. I've not heard that one.
Oh, right. Well, I think it's probably started and sue me with Vicky Asnaran. Probably the first and they say, look, you'll get your monthly check, but you shut up.
Right.
Right. The offer to me was that they'd get a gallery owner to give me a lifetime contract to buy paintings from me. And,
interesting.
I was a bit rude in the reply. I know they tape recorded it, but they should know I tape recorded it too, and I still know.
Of course.
But
I was offered a lump sum to sell my YouTube channel.
Oh wow!
To Scientology.
How much?
They did try that. I think if I remember right, it was an insultingly low amount. I think it was like literally a few $1,000s.
I'll hold out for at least.
Oh yeah.
You know what?
Oh yeah. Well, I played with them. because they were emailing me, and so I emailed them back, and I immediately, it was funny because I immediately infoed Tony Ortega on it because I was like, you got to see this.
Did you make me an offer I can't refuse?
I said, look, man, you know, if you expect me to give over my right to freedom of speech, you're gonna have to pay me a hell of a lot more than $5,000 or $10,000 or whatever it was. I think it was even less than that. It was an insulting amount, you know.
That is derisory.
Yeah.
I mean, I sat in a meeting and they had one of Sherman, Lenski and Heller, their top law firm, in the room. There were 8 of them. I can't even remember. But they'd flown all the way to the little village in England where I live to come and sit and have a meeting with me. And
Wow.
I sat there and my lawyer said, right, well, before we start, there needs to be at least £250,000 on the table. And I looked at her and said, what? What are you talking about? I'm not, selling that. So I said to them, what are your ranks in the Sea Org? And they refused to tell me. So I left the meeting and they flown from Los Angeles all the way here to talk to me. But it's, I wanted to know if they were higher in rank than Midshipman David Miscavige.
Well, now, David is a captain now, and he's the one, and it's not a brevet rank.
Yeah, but
according to the testimony to the IRS.
Good to know, but of course he's the person who demoted Ron Hubbard from Admiral to Commodore. Because
Commodore is lesser than Admiral.
Absolutely, Admiral. I think he should have been a Vice Admiral personally, or a Rear Admiral, but we know what they get up.
Yeah, exactly.
Good for them as well.
Interesting.
Jim Morrison of the Doors, his father was an admiral in the U.S. Navy. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, I learn something new every day. Yeah. So, okay, let's get back on the rails. Brainwashing.
Since then, let me say the rest of it. So from about 1996 onwards, I researched other forms of authoritarian group. I've researched 100 and more so-called cult groups, pseudo-therapy groups, pseudo-religious groups, commercial groups, multi-level marketing, large group awareness trainings, going right back to the Eleusinian mysteries in 1800 BC or whenever that was, through all sorts of religion, tens and tens of books. You want to talk about the Sufis, I can talk about the Sufis till the cows come home. The pigs don't come home because they're not allowed to. I studied the psychology, how does this stuff work? I just became fascinated by the experience I saw people going through. And the one experience that really fascinated me was this. When I realized that Ron Hubbard contradicted himself, I realized that he was a liar. And for me, that was the end of everything. Because, as L. Ron Hubbard said, honesty is sanity. As L. Ron Hubbard said, the road to truth is trod with true steps. So if he was a liar, it was a lie. And I walked away from it, threw it all away and said, I will reincorporate any of it that I find to be true. So far, none of it has had any value to me, and it's 36 years later. I have never had the desire to pick up the cans again. There are some trivial things. I've shown where they were stolen from, where they were plagiarized from. Basically, Scientology is a system of conditioning, enslavement, psychological enslavement that leads people to become auditing junkies so that they're desperate to do the next level. But just like when you order that package from Amazon, by the time it arrives, you're interested in ordering the next one. So, you're on OT2, but that's because you want to do OT3. And then you find that you're inhabited with a load of body thetans and all that stuff. I became interested in terrorism, in gangs, terrorism way before 9/11, and going, wait a minute, the groups are different, but the human beings, we are the same. And what's happening to us is the same. So I came to understand what human predators are like and the techniques that they use, and have been exposing those things ever since, and finding out that most people don't want to know. Because while advertising does work on everybody I know, it doesn't work on me. So, my mission for the last certainly 5 or 6 years has been solely to provide preventative material to younger people, to adolescents, and indeed to anybody who'll listen, so that in the couple of hours it takes to explain to somebody what a predator is like and how they behave, you can prevent somebody from having the experience of having to spend 10 years recovering from what a predator did to them. And I've dealt now with about 600 people in recovery from different groups, and authoritarian relationships where somebody dominates another person, coercive control relationships. So that's who I am, and that's my business. And I've done it without profit financially. So if anybody would like to send me a huge amount of money, that's always welcome. And I'm here to boost my YouTube channel, Jon Atack Family and Friends. That's the main purpose here. I've got over 200 subscribers now.
Yeah, Jon's just got a fledgling channel, and it's just getting going, and he's putting up a lot of good content, by the way, guys. He and his son, and it's definitely worth checking out, and I will definitely plug this, and have no problem promoting Jon's channel here on that, so check it out.
So what would you like to know about brainwashing, Chris?
Yes. Well, first off, let's be super clear, because there is all kinds of straw manning, as I mentioned earlier here, on this particular topic. This is not a neutral, objective topic. This is a hot topic amongst certain people, and there are really, there's a lot of hostility about this, even in some quarters. So first, what I thought we should do is really clearly define what we're talking about. And I looked a couple things up, and I wanted to run these by you and see, what do you think of this? Because this is just straight off the internet. I just looked it up and went, okay.
Very, very reliable.
Yeah, perfect, right? So here we go. I mean, you look at, in other words, I look in a dictionary, and I looked on Wikipedia, right?
Yeah.
And people can, clown on Wikipedia all day, but it is a good source of information to link you to other places. It's good for that, and that's what I use it for.
Yeah.
Okay, the process, noun definition, the process of pressuring someone into adopting radically different beliefs by using systematic and often forcible means. Or, of course, the verb, make someone adopt radically different beliefs by using systematic and often forcible pressure. And in Wikipedia, the article defines brainwashing, also known as mind control, menticide, death of the mind, right? Coercive persuasion. Yeah. Yep. Thought control, thought reform, and re-education. All these terms we have used. Brainwashing is the concept that the human mind can be altered or controlled by certain psychological techniques. Brainwashing is said to reduce its subject's ability to think critically or independently, to allow the introduction of new, unwanted thoughts and ideas into the subject's mind, as well as to change his or her attitudes, values, and beliefs. Okay. What do you think?
The first definition has the word forcible, and the second doesn't. The first definition is technically correct. Brainwashing was not purely a psychological means. It has a very exact beginning. The straw man is Edward Hunter, who will be brought up every time. People will say, oh, he worked for the CIA. He didn't. He worked for the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, the precursor of the CIA. But when he first used the term brainwashing, which was in the Miami News of 24th of September 1950, he was no longer an operative of the Central Intelligence Agency. It may, however, have been suggested to him by them. But the straw man aspect of this is very straightforward, that it's this word brainwashing is invented somehow by this guy who works for the CIA. He was a journalist, and let's just throw him away. Let's just say we're not really interested in what he had to say. It may be that he only had one source to tell this story. Let's instead look to an academic appraisal of brainwashing. And what I have in front of me is this shiny book here.
Perfect.
This book was published in 1955 by an associate professor at Yale. His main source, he did interview quite a lot of people, but his main sources are published documents, not even private documents, from the Chinese Communist Party. And I'm going to read out something that they said. It was published in People's China, which was a newspaper published by the Chinese government. It is not easy for old-type intellectuals, particularly those from feudal backgrounds, to learn to use this essential weapon for self-improvement in a correct manner. Now, they are talking about what they would call see now, which in the Wade Giles, for those academics among you, is spelled HSINAO, and in the Pinyin, the more recent form, is spelled XICNAO. It is said to be possibly a pun on the Confucian si hisin, which is the process of cleansing the heart, which of course in Chinese thinking is where thinking happens. Just as we think love happens there, the Chinese traditionally believed that was the organ of thinking. And it must be cleansed or washed. So having a clear conscience is another way of saying the same thing. You'll find that it in Taoist thought going back at least 1,000 years. Well, I have a reference from about 1200 AD, actually. So at least 800 years, correct myself quickly. But this is the term not invented by Edward Hunter, but used standardly by the Chinese. Its origins are in, the first use I know is 1929.
This is the clean brain or wash brain.
Literally.
Wash mind.
C means wash and now means brain.
Okay.
So it wasn't Edward Hunter who came up with this, and we can forget about whether he belonged to the CIA or what anybody was thinking. As you say, it's a straw man argument.
Right. And by the way, folks, if you haven't heard about any of this and you don't know who Edward Hunter is, it's okay to kind of skip over a little bit of this, but it's important because this is the kind of thing that if you do start Googling it or you start looking into it, and even if you look it up on Wikipedia, you're going to find this guy's name coming up. And this is classically used, and other similar arguments I'm sure we'll cover, by academics right now in courts of law as expert witnesses against people who are trying to get some justice and some recompense from cults who abuse them for years or even decades. They go into court, they're like, hey, I was abused, this happened to me, and these guys come trotting in and say, it's all a fantasy, there's no such thing, mind control doesn't exist, and they're paid for this, by the way, and they come in and do this, and academics, who definitely should know better, write papers castigating brainwashing, the entire concept of it. They say it's all nonsense. So that's the background that we're sort of addressing some of this from, in case you're wondering why we're talking about this the way we are, going all the way back to the beginning like this. So, John, please continue.
Thank you. You've just said they're paid for their expert witness testimony. Let's give some idea of that. That would be around $3,000 to $10,000 a day.
Yep. That's right.
I've been an expert witness, but somehow I didn't attract those kind of fees. But I am an acknowledged expert witness by the High Court in London, in fact, since 1987. So I too have some authority, but not on the subject of brainwashing. Nobody has expert authority on that as yet. This program definitely occurred in China. It was called brainwashing. And as it says, you know, this was the essential weapon for self-improvement in a correct manner. At first, there is often the liberal tendency to spare the feelings of one's fellow students by softening one's criticisms. Some students take criticism meetings as an occasion for attacking others in a non-constructive and uncomradely manner. Now, this is talking about what's called thought struggle, self-criticism, or self-cultivation. This process was introduced by a man called Li Xiaoqiu. And my Chinese pronunciation is probably dreadful. That means that the first...
Better than mine.
Well, the first bit is what we would use as a surname, as an end name, Li. Li was one of Mao Zedong's chief cadres, that is to say, followers within the communist sense. He studied with Malenkov, who was one of Stalin's chief cadres. And this process was developed in the 1920s in Russia. And the idea is basically to make somebody so hostile to themselves that they will do exactly what they're told. By the time Mao took power on the 1st of October 1949 in China, 200,000 of his followers had been through a systematic program called Xenu. Did it exist? Yes, it did. Was it successful? Well, let's just run forward a little bit. It was then imposed for 4 years on anybody who disagreed, and millions of people went through this process. It's well known. There is no argument about it. You know, Wikipedia or wherever you want to go, there's no argument about it. Was the process successful? Well, China had been in a terrible civil war since the emperor was removed and the Kuomintang under Sun Yat-sen and then Chiang Kai-shek fought a battle to try and overthrow the warlords, the communists, whoever. That had been going on for 30 years. So you'd had an incredibly more than 30 years, an incredibly divided society. Now, if you come right up to the last few weeks, an incredible documentary called One Child Nation has been released, I think, on PBS in the US, on the BBC here. It's still on the BBC iPlayer here for anybody who can hack that, who's outside the country. This is a woman called Nanfu Wang, who grew up in China 6 years ago, went to the States, had a baby a year ago, and thought, I'll go home and see the folks, and I'll make a documentary. And she makes this chilling documentary about the one-child policy in China, introduced first in 1979 and enforced from 1983 to 2015. What the one-child policy meant was that once you'd had a child, you were forcibly sterilized.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah. And
I did not know that. Wow.
They have photographic evidence of women being bundled up in sacks and dragged to clinics where they're given probably a tubal ligation. So it's in full. There are people talking in this documentary about live babies being murdered, about babies that were near full term being aborted and poisoned. And they show you, and if you're squeamish, do not watch this documentary. They show you babies that are almost at full term that have been disposed in medical waste bags on rubbish heaps. The Chinese government boasts that 380 million lives were terminated in this fashion.
Wow.
There's a woman in the documentary who says that she personally, and these are all interviews in China, she personally sterilized or caused forced abortions to 50 to 60,000 women.
I don't even have words right now for what you're telling me.
Yeah. One child.
This is Holocaust level.
Yes.
This is horrifying.
Yeah. And you want numbers. Mao Zedong is estimated to have killed 70 million people. He is the greatest mass murderer in all history. And there's a big picture of him in Tiananmen Square right now, in a fascist nation which purports to be communist, but is in fact a complete tyranny and has been from its inception. The story of Zhong Chang and John Holliday have written a biography of Mao called Mao, the Unknown Story, which is the only book in my whole life that I've had to actually put down because I couldn't take it anymore. And it took me 2 weeks to go back to it. And that was reading the descriptions of torture that Mao used to like to watch. Now, so you've got this group of people, and did brainwashing work? Well, you've got a completely divided empire. You can't call China a country. It's 50 countries. You've got a completely divided empire with everybody fighting. Well, now when Nanfu Wang goes and interviews people about the one-child policy, even women who were forcibly sterilized say it was a good thing for China. So is it possible to bring about a conformity of thought in a huge population? Yes, it is. Is it still happening? Yes. In the Xinjiang province in the northwest, 1 million people, 10% of the population of Uyghurs, who are a Muslim people who are ethnically different from the 90% Han who are in the Chinese empire, 1/10 of the population have been forcibly rounded up and put into camps where they're being put into a program where they have to learn Chinese, Mandarin, and they basically are having their religious beliefs worked on. Their children are being taken from them and not allowed to learn their language. Very much the sort of thing the British did in Australia and with Welsh children, that the US did with the children of Native Americans, ripping their culture away from them. This is all part of what the Chinese call brainwashing. So is there such thing as brainwashing? They've called it that. They've done it. The process itself, as I said before, was often forcible, that people were shackled. You would be taken to one of the camps, and Robert J. Lifton's remarkable text, what what is it called? It's called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, published in 1961. Still an incredible book because he is so precise, he is so exact. The process would be you'd be taken, it'd been decided that you were a reactionary. You were a person who didn't accept that Mao Zedong was God on earth, and that the Chinese Communist Party, which allowed everybody equal rights to believe that Mao was God on earth, if you didn't believe, or in fact, if you made any criticism, and this is for real, this has gone on from 1949 to now, any criticism, you're imprisoned. It is an offense to criticize the state. And
if that is not exactly like Scientology, folks, then I don't know what is, because in the only place I've ever lived where it was illegal to criticize the leader was when I lived in Scientology, when I lived on a Scientology base. And by illegal, I mean literally against the justice codes of Scientology. It was
considered
in writing.
a high crime.
That's right. And that's why we get declared when we speak up against David Miscavige personally in Scientology or L. Ron Hubbard. So I'm making that comparison because so many of you have watched so many of my content and know what I'm talking about with that. Take that, expand it by about 1 million, and that's what you get John describing here in China. It scales, in other words.
I mean, the important part of the process is Alexandra Stein, in her Terror, Love and Brainwashing, talks about to isolate and engulf a person. So you take somebody, and as I say, the thing that scared the hell out of me watching One Child Nation was that people that this had been done to were still saying it was a good idea, that China couldn't have survived without this. Well, let's deal with that idea, the idea that, you know, China controlled its population by doing this. What we know in the West is that if you give people enough to eat and birth control methods, then the population goes down. So Japan, in fact, has a less than 1.5 birth rate, and they're getting desperate about it. Most Western countries now have a birth rate of less than 2. So you don't have to murder hundreds of millions. You don't have to sterilize hundreds of millions of women against their will and traumatize a whole generation and cause the psychological consequences of that. You don't have to have a society which brutally disregards civil rights to actually get through the Malthusian problem and bring your population down. So it was just a continuation of authoritarian barbarism, this program. With the two-child program, which came in under President Xi in 2015, one presumes that women are forcibly sterilized after they've had 2 children.
Right. It's not to say that this is, yeah, exactly. Why would we assume that because the one-child program doesn't exist anymore, that they wouldn't extend those same penalties, let's say?
Well, the law says you can only have 2 children.
No, exactly, that they would extend it out now. So, so now we're going to let you all have 2, and we're going to keep the exact same control mechanism in place to make sure to enforce that will. Let me ask you, China is a different country from the United States in many, many, many ways, going all the way down to a culture and education and the way the family itself, the family unit is even regarded.
Yes.
Very, very different than Western civilization. And some might think that itself might lend, make it easier to corrupt the minds of, or something like that, these people, as opposed to the Western, more individualistic, sort of exceptionalist attitude. I'm throwing this out there. I don't particularly think that our Western exceptionalism or individualism safeguards us in any way, but I'm wondering whether you think that might be a cultural factor in why China would buy into that wholesale.
No, I think it was the sheer brutality that brought China into it. That you have to understand with Mao, before he became the leader of the Communist Party, he clawed his way there. There's a period, I think it's 1931, where he has 10,000 troops under his control. And a program comes in from Stalin, who, of course, the Russians funded the entire Chinese Communist Party right through it taking power. They continued to fund the first 5-year plan in China. That Mao actually murders 4,000 out of 10,000 of his own troops on the grounds that they are anti-Bolshevik. So,
How did that work?
well, Stalin adopted the technique, and it was called a purge thereafter.
Oh, got it.
You
Okay.
basically create a situation, and again, this will remind you of Scientology, where people, the main policy, which Walker talks about in his book, is to get people to spy on everyone else.
Snitching culture, right?
Yeah, the snitching culture. And you are terrified of, I met a guy from Estonia who was tricked into going to St. Hill, the Scientology base center in England. And he lasted about a week, and he on his way out, because we kind of ran an underground railroad for defectors, getting them back home to wherever in the world they'd been tricked from. And he said, one day he looked at somebody and he said, "Oh, I know what you do here. It's just like Stalinism. You think one thing, you say another, and you act a third." And they threw him out.
I'll bet they did. They don't like being called on the carpet for what they're actually doing, but that's not really what's going on. What's really going on is cognitive dissonance is being created, and they freak out and just want to get rid of the source of the cognitive dissonance, so they just kick him out.
And if we come to cognitive dissonance, all cultures, all human beings, no matter what their cultural background, you can get cognitive dissonance going, because whether you've got an individualistic culture or a family culture, you can find what somebody believes and utilize it against them.
That's right.
The astonishing things that people will say, like, the idea that in the United States that there are so many people who speak Spanish. Well, oddly enough, if you look at the names of places in the United States, like Los Angeles, San Francisco, you will find that there actually was a massive Spanish-speaking population there, which only in the 19th century, in 1847, I think, when California was bought, were those lands passed over. But the people who lived in them were Spanish-speaking in New Mexico, in Texas, in Arizona, in Florida. And of course, in Mississippi and Missouri, they were French-speaking. And up in the north, some of them were speaking Swedish, apparently. No accounting for taste. But this peculiar notion that you can bring together people from all over Europe who've been fighting each other for centuries, and they become the white nationalists,
It's kind of, it is kind of hilarious, isn't it?
Yeah. But
I mean, the irony, the just the stupidity of it all is just, it does wear you down a little bit, watching the multi-generational nonsense that goes on. I mean, You're making a brilliant point. I mean, California is filled with names of places that are Spanish, from the top to the bottom.
Yeah, and it's been Spanish for a few hundred years.
Exactly. And people just don't even think this obviously. It's like, duh. Anyway.
I live in one of the few countries that hasn't had a major shift of population in 900 years.
Yeah.
1066. Yeah. Everywhere.
But look at how they're reacting now in London to the influx of immigrants that do come in. I mean, they're freaking out. Their heads are exploding. I've seen the some of the racist stuff that comes out of England or London just as much as it comes out of the deep south.
If we looked, let's shift out of China and think about Germany. Germany was the most sophisticated group of states because, of course, it only became a country at the end of the 19th century. But this produced some of the greatest artists, some of the greatest philosophers, some of the greatest scientists and thinkers.
Scientists, yeah, big time. Germany was the seat of academic affluence, I guess you'd say. I mean, there was a lot of stuff coming out of Germany.
And where in 1914, the German population believed that they were bringing civilization to the rest of Europe.
Right.
Where, that they were coming up against the feudal system that still dominated Russia, Austro-Hungary, and Britain, that they were bringing radical, new, wonderful ideas. And what we got was ultimately the Nazis, because German nationalism rose up and found its enemy. And so is it possible to influence a whole population of people in a very short period of time? If you brutalize them, if you terrorize them, if you starve them, it's possible to do things with human beings very rapidly. And the brainwashing program came out of that by the 1950s, it was no longer necessary, though 1 million people were killed in the first year in China. They went out. Part of the program that university students took in China was that they'd go out in a group of about 1,000 and they would watch an execution. And an execution in China would often include such things as death by 1,000 cuts.
Oh wow, those aren't just expressions. Those are realities.
Yeah, somebody would be tied and they would be cut and cut and cut until they bled to death. Jesus. And the idea was to bring up a fervor in the crowd watching, the hatred towards the other.
It's medieval.
It is medieval, and it's still functioning in our society today.
Right. Of course it is. If America could televise executions, they would. Yeah. I mean, just to be really kind of cynical right now, but yeah.
Public executions were always attended, and they still are. And there are people who get their jollies by seeing other people being harmed, which is not very pro-social.
No, it's not. It's
not. Very good for you.
So we've answered the question pretty thoroughly through China, through Germany, and there are so many examples I could bring up right now of how Americans are brainwashed on so many topics, but we don't even have to go there. I think we've made the point that it is a real thing, and it can and has worked in the past, and that the brutality is an important component of this, or certainly at least the threat of brutality. But it really does have to be followed through on a few times, and examples have to be made.
What happens then is a transition, which is why I picked up on the word forcible. The brainwashing program was forcible, and you will see aspects of that. I mean, look at the film The Report, and I think everybody should look at the film The Report that's come out in the last month about the Feinstein report into torture used by the CIA and the level of brutality that was accepted. And I would say that a culture had been created within the CIA where people were willing to do things which are absolutely inhumane. I mean, they killed people. There was one guy they call it waterboarding, 183 times. He wasn't waterboarded. Waterboarding is a technique that the Spanish Inquisition first designed. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
Yep, used in the 17th century in Spain. We did it first. So, all these Spanish-speaking people, they know more about it. But waterboarding means putting a towel over somebody's face and wetting the towel so you get a drowning response. The waterboarding done by the CIA meant pouring water through the towel and half drowning people. It was totally ineffectual. The guy who was waterboarded 183 times gave no intelligence of any kind. The British had abandoned torture in the 1970s because eventually it was accepted it doesn't work. But it does work. It can break a human being for a lifetime. It can traumatize them so thoroughly that they will never function again. Again, there were detainees in Northern Ireland who were completely illegally imprisoned and put through the hooding program and the stress positions program and the we don't let you go to the toilet part, which is what Don Rumsfeld didn't talk about when he said he stands up to work every day. People were put through that program who are still now receiving counseling to try and help them. And that was in 1971. So you can break and tame people. What was discovered along the way, though, and Ron Hubbard was very interested in this, he offered to sell his brainwashing to President John F. Kennedy. He wrote a letter saying, you can buy my brainwashing. He wrote the brainwashing manual, pretending it was a Russian document. And he frequently talked about brainwashing, and he certainly believed it did exist. He also, in 1952, of course, said, we have ways of making slaves here. And I think that that's where it moves over, that what the mind control program run by American, Canadian, and British intelligence, programs like MK Naomi, MK Ultra, Project Bluebird in the US Navy, those programs were designed to intimidate people, but not to use violence anymore. Then you get to slip over into the, well, can we do this just using coercive control with no threat of violence? And the answer is, yes, we can. Naomi Klein, who I think is the most remarkable journalist working today, wrote a book called Shock Doctrine, where she said, no, the CIA programs did work. that they put out the propaganda that it hadn't worked, so we'd leave them alone. They found out ways of influencing people where you don't have to use BZ, or of course they introduced LSD to the world as part of their mind control program, which Ken Kesey was very grateful about.
And we have to say, folks, that there's every reason to doubt the veracity of government statements on this matter, because it's in their vested interest to want to control populations. I mean, this is not conspiratorial dot connecting. All of this is documented. This is historical fact that these things happened. You know,
yeah, let me say something terrible. Let me say something absolutely terrible. I saw the report last week. It's only just been released. I've been aware of the Feinstein report for a long time, but I hadn't read it, and I may have to, even though it's 650 pages long. Here is what appalls me. Barack Obama decided not to release that report. Barack Obama decided not to prosecute anyone who was responsible, and there were deaths on this program. Nobody was prosecuted. I say somebody who talks about transparency and accountability should be held accountable. I believe that George W. Bush and that Barack Obama should be tried as war criminals. And I believe this whole bipartisan Democrats versus Republicans is two power lobbies fighting each other. And they're fighting against each other, not for the sake of serving the people, but for the sake of serving a neoliberal or neoconservative agenda, neither of which gives a damn about the regular person in the Rust Belt, or, you know, the working Joe, or about anybody who's got a blue collar. This is like Lehman Brothers. I don't know if you saw the documentary where Richard Falk, speaks about, you see him on video going, I want to tear the heart out and I want to see them die while I'm watching them. And this is the head of the corporation that bankrupted the world. He, by the way, was never charged with any offense and is now running another multi-billion hedge fund. So
yeah, exactly. So
predators.
I mean, kind of, you know, oversimplification for sure, but I'm going to say this anyway. If you guys can't see the brainwashing that's going on at all levels of society with this,
you're brainwashed.
You know what I mean? I mean, come on, you know?
Yeah.
All right, but fair enough. Like I said, I don't want to engage in a lot of oversimplification, and you're doing a great job of getting into the details of this, and I really appreciate it, because you know all these things are just off the tip of your tongue, and I'm aware of a lot of this stuff, but the specifics elude me sometimes, and that's why I love talking to you about this stuff.
Thank
you. Your memory is just steel trap, and I love
I've got it written on the back of my hand.
Okay, now I've got some other points I want to cover with this, and we've covered the workability, or the fact that it's a legit operation, that you can brainwash people, and I think we've shown at a mass level, which is really where it's most effective, or what it was really designed for was mass, you know, mass manipulation. Let's put it that way. But I'm going to take up a couple more points of faux debunking that has been done on this, right? These lines that come out from the academics or from the government.
In faux debunking.
Yeah, faux debunking. That's right. Beginning, and I'm just going to read I'm going to read something here, and then I'm going to say something. I want you to tell me what you think of this. Beginning in 1953, this is quoted from the Wikipedia article, which a lot of people could see, which is why I actually pull from theirs, because I think it's a place most people go to find out stuff. Beginning in 1953, Robert J. Lifton interviewed American servicemen who had been POWs during the Korean War, as well as priests, students, and teachers who had been held in prison in China after 1951. This is the book we referred to earlier, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. In addition to interviews with 25 Americans and Europeans, Lifton interviewed 15 Chinese citizens who had fled after having been subjected to indoctrination in Chinese universities. We've just discussed some of that.
Yep.
Lifton's 1961 book was based on this research. Lifton found, now here's the debunk, or the faux debunk, right? Lifton found that when the POWs returned to the United States, their thinking soon returned to normal, contrary to the popular image of brainwashing. Now, my statement on that is that this isn't contrary to what we know about thought reform at all. it's another straw man, I think, because if someone's indoctrination starts to wear off, it's because they're in an environment where it's not being reinforced or
Yes.
cultivated, which is why cults and governments have to create and maintain a bubble world, a prison of belief, if you will,
Yeah.
to borrow the phrase from Lawrence Wright. So what do you think about what I just said?
I think it's absolutely true. That the first point is that Wikipedia makes a slight error there.
Ah,
One of the 25 Europeans continued to believe,
ah,
and he had been a Catholic priest.
right.
So and let's undercut that. The English writer Somerset Maugham, novelist Somerset Maugham, said that the spiritual teachings of Ignatius Loyola were the most effective form of brainwashing ever devised by man. So let's cut before the Chinese that when the Catholic Church was suddenly the Protestant Revolution had occurred, the Reformation had occurred, the Counter-Reformation was created. And if you look at this little book, and you can, it's still used in the training of Jesuits, and of course the Jesuits train all Catholic priests. Just like to put that in there. And the head of the Jesuit college was busted for child molesting.
Was he?
Yep.
You know, it's so funny because the Jesuits are always positioned, at least to my experience, the Jesuits are always positioned as the smart guys, the learned ones, the educators, the ones who don't get in trouble. And there we have the head of the Jesuit order
in Rome, the
kids.
man who is the head of, and this is the head of the training of all priests. Let's get some numbers in here. That in the Australian Royal Commission inquiry, there were 8,000 cases of abuse by priests, and 500 priests in Australia alone were named. So you have a corrupt organisation. You know, let's not beat about the bush here. I have nothing at all against Christianity. I'm absolutely fine as long as Christians are pro-social in their activities, life affirming. That's absolutely fine. Good for them. Many great things have been done. And I am absolutely opposed to the molesting, the rape of children. And that we are talking now about tens of thousands of cases which have not been effectively dealt with to this day. We've got spotlight about the Boston Globe investigation. This has happened in dioceses throughout the world. Okay, one of their training manuals, and it's well worth looking at. It's very short. You can probably find it online because copyright ran out in the 17th century. You know, this is how you get somebody back into the Catholic Church if they've become a Protestant. That was its first thing. So you can, for example, you know, and again in Scientology, you'll have seen creative processing. There are people who, and I'm one of them, who define hypnosis as guided imagination. That's all it is. If you can guide somebody's imagination, get them to believe something, then you've hypnotized them. You've altered their reality. You've brainwashed them, let's say. So, for example, you sit somebody down, you say, yeah, what if you're wrong? What I want you to do is to imagine that you're in hell and you're feeling the flesh dripping from your bones. It's called creative processing by L. Ron Hubbard. And borrowed,
Right, of
from
course, yes.
Aleister Crowley, of course, is the person that he got the technique from, which I have proved in a paper called Possible Origins for Dianetics and Scientology, which academics don't seem to want to read. But they've got their problems, I've got mine. I would like to say, actually, if there are any academics watching, that if they dismiss my work, Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, my book about Scientology, has 1,117 reference notes in it. And you can go and check the sources, and you'll find that most of them are Ron Hubbard. So, you know, there's food for that. You're exactly right that normally what it requires is a reinforcing environment. But one Catholic priest, so he'd been through all of the spiritual teachings of Ignatius Loyola, and then he'd been through all of this stuff. I mean, watch the movie Silence, which I think Scorsese directed, which is about the Jesuits trying to get back into Japan after Christianity had been banned there. And the punishment for Christianity was being crucified. It's like, oh dear, things people do. The in fact, I mentioned that because I read the book by Shusaku Endo when I was about 20, which is a very long time ago. And it really impacted on me because Shusaku Endo is a 20th century Japanese Christian writing about these historical events. What was interesting was that his culture was Japanese. He didn't write like a European. There were things that he just accepted as perfectly normal, which to you or me would be kind of odd. Like in China for 1500 years, when your daughter was 7 years old, you break her foot.
What?
Yeah, you'd break her foot. 1500 years this went on. It's called the 3-inch lily. Don't put any illustrations up. Chinese women were meant to have feet that were 3 inches long. You break the foot, you bind it, and the girl will never be able to run and never be able to walk properly. For 1500 years, one of the most sophisticated cultures the world had ever seen did this because it was acceptable. Now, at that point, you can throw brainwashing out of the window. Once a culture is the Romans, when they were invaded by the Huns, they started getting their babies and putting boards on their heads so they would have this high, flat forehead like the Huns did because they admired it. They thought it was a fashion statement. There are certain African people where they hoop the neck. The Xenu in the Amazon put in these things in their ears and in their lips and lower down in their bodies, but we won't talk about that. This because it's culturally accepted that you behave in this way. So if you can find me a completely sane, intelligent group of human beings who live in a totally moral way for us to, compare ourselves to, good luck, basically.
Yeah, big time.
We accept all sorts of things. People drink Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, and colas. I think it's Nepal, one of the Himalayan states, has banned these drinks because, as the health minister says, there are no benefits to this. The only thing that's good for you in it is the water. The rest of it is hurting you. The rest of it is bad for you. The 23 spoons of sugar but our culture accepts that. Supersize me. And you will be supersized. There's no doubt about it. We take things exactly. We take things on as
supersized.
Exactly. What was his name? The guy who made Supersize Me. He eats McDonald's and supersizes and puts on a massive weight.
Morgan, that's right, Morgan Spurlock. Well, like you said, you can just kind of throw the brainwashing out the window at that point, right?
It's how you create a culture. And if, looking at pictures of lynchings, there's a picture on the internet of which is the remains of a carcass of a black man that's been barbecued. And behind it, there are all these folks smiling and drinking beer. Now, I can't get my head around that. But
I can't either.
Create a culture where hatred is a vital aspect. And this brings us, let's go sideways into this idea that's called the seat theory. The sociopath, apath, empath triad. It's seat theory. I mean, it's silly. This is a psychologist called Jane McGregor, who's actually at university about 6 miles away from me. I have yet to meet her, but I read her book. She hypothesizes that our society consists of 3 types of people: empaths, sociopaths, and what she calls apaths. And you can pretty much, Schopenhauer, the philosopher, reckoned that 60% of people you could do anything with. Stanley Milgram proved it. And what happens, she reckons, in society, and this is a bit like Hubbard's suppressive person thing, only he was one, the sociopath gets the apaths to attack the empaths. And that is the history of the world. That as you look back in history, you'll find that monarchs, tribal leaders, chieftains, are for the most part sociopaths, narcissistic sociopaths. They are astonishingly destructive. For example, in England, in our history books when I was a child, we were taught about good Queen Bess, Elizabeth I, marvelous woman, highly educated. What you're not told, you have to read a bit more deeply, is that in her long reign, she spent more time with one court official than any other, her chief torturer, discussing methods of torture.
You're kidding. Wow.
It was
the
an
stuff you
offense.
find out, man.
It was an offense to show a portrait of her that had not been approved. All portraits of her were cancelled and had to be destroyed, and the one portrait was sent out. It looked nothing like her because, of course, she'd lost skin because she'd put lead white on her face. Her hair had fallen out when she was a little girl, and
oh yeah, is this the woman that they recently made the movie?
they've made one or two about.
Yeah, they did a few movies where they've talked about this. All right.
And her sister Bloody Mary, who's a Catholic, gets the really bad rep.
Right.
But you look at it, and power tends to corrupt absolute power absolutely.
Well, there is a bigger meta world going on here that outside the brainwashing thing that we're talking about, because ultimately what we're talking about is a tool that is used to manipulate people, right? It's a tool, it's a procedure, it's a methodology. It consists of a number of different techniques. Basically, anything that will cause harm is capable of manipulating somebody's thoughts.
And it's
also things that can cause. Yeah, exactly. There's also the other end of the spectrum where euphoria can cause somebody's thinking to be changed or manipulated in a not so great way, even though they feel great. Auditing, for example.
Euphoria
and as you said, it's
almost always part of the process. That what you're doing is you're slamming people between mania, you could say.
That's right.
And terror. And you've talked with our good friend Yuval Orr about this, that you can induce awe in a person, and at that point their thinking capacity collapses, and you can then inflict a certainty on them. The certainty that Hitler is right, the certainty that Stalin is right. There's a great movie called The Inner Circle by a director called Andrei Konchalova, and it's about Stalin's film projectionist. And he's the guy who he shows the films to Stalin every night and watches the Politburo getting drunk and people being put on the list and murdered. And he thinks that Stalin is just the most incredible man who ever lived. I remember I recommended it to Robert Vaughan Young, and who was 20 years in the Sea Org and was the man who announced Hubbard's death, the head of PR, all of this. And he watched the movie and he said, that's what the Sea Org's like. You're the projectionist. You see it all happening around you, but you believe that ultimate victory will be achieved once you've, destroyed enough lives. Everybody will be happy. And
that's exactly right. I was there and I lived it for 17 years. And if there is anything I get to talk about with some authority, it's this.
Yes.
And and it's not a lot of things I get to talk about with certainty, with authority, but this is one of those things. And I'm telling you that is a great description of exactly what it's like, because you do not see what is right in front of your eyes. You do not see it. You do not see it for what it is. You see it as something different. And that is thought reform. You're reforming a person's thoughts about the things that they are seeing and hearing and experiencing.
And you're again, coming to the cognitive dissonance, Festinger's model, which Steve Hassan has adapted into his BITE model, that you control behavior, information, thought, and emotion. I would say you also control time and environment.
Good points.
You can bite in two different ways there. But perhaps I believe that information control is the most important aspect of this. And when we're having this discussion because Steve Hassan's published The Cult of Trump, and an associate professor at a Chicago university has written a paper published in a magazine called Religion and Politics, in which he reviews the title of the book.
Exactly.
Not having read it. Academics are getting lazier and lazier. And he doesn't like the word cult. And apparently, the word brainwashing is not really a word that Steve uses. I've known Steve for 30 years. It's not a word we tend to use because we don't want to get into a populist misunderstanding. We want to be precise. I tend to talk about exploitative persuasion, undue influence, coercive control. And Zeller says that brainwashing is not recognized by psychiatry. It's not recognized in the law. So let me just read. This is the current manual of the American Psychiatric Association, DSM-5. And it says, DSM-5, dissociative disorders not otherwise specified, and then gives us some numbers. Identity disturbance due to prolonged and intense coercive persuasion individuals who have been subjected to intense coercive persuasion, exemplar gratia, for example, brainwashing. Oh, psychiatry no longer believes in it. This is the current edition, published in 2012. For example, brainwashing, thought reform, indoctrination while captive, torture, long-term political imprisonment, recruitment by sects, cults, another word which apparently they don't use, by terror organizations, may present with prolonged changes in or conscious questioning of their identity. Who am I anymore? Now, I went back as far as 1987 to check that definition through all of the editions. It's been there. It's never been removed. So whatever the American Psychological Association pronounced in a single court case that was actually to do with false memory and repressed memory, as I understand it, not to do with brainwashing, is irrelevant. They had not the expertise to talk on it. Psychiatrists who deal with the actual mental disorders caused by such things, psychologists are there just to look at the normal stuff, maybe offer a bit of counseling for normal problems. Intense problems like this one, dissociative disorders, where somebody, they can't be in their own head. You know, like with Scientology, they've gone exterior.
Yeah, right.
It's that serious. And
no, it's a thing, and it's this comes up, and people will rely on the fact. The Zeller guy who writes this article about Hassan's book, it was just taking Hassan to task on the cult of Trump, which we did a whole podcast on here a week or two ago. That it's ignorance feeding more ignorance, you know. It's agendas, and this is what really bugs me about this. And one of the things that I was so disappointed in when I first became exposed to the academic community of the ex-cult world is how many occult apologists there are in the academic community. And I just keep calling them that because that's the phrase I use. But, you know, scumbags is another term you could use. But these are just people who are intellectually dishonest. And I wanted to quickly, before I forget, plug what you just said about information control, because I think that you're absolutely right, that is the senior letter of the bite model. Because information coming in, that's how you manipulate people. That's how you get the emotional manipulation and the thought manipulation. And to a degree, environmental manipulation, but you know there are other things going on with that too. But I think you're right about the flow of information available to a person and how it is given to them is crucial to the whole technique. And
how you teach them to interpret reality, which is where the environment comes all the way back in. What are you seeing and what does it mean? You know, Freudians dream Freudian dreams and Jungians dream Jungian dreams.
Right.
Scientologists dream about Xenu and the body thetan. Oh, I hope nobody died because I said that. Right. The reason that Shusaku Endo's silence was perhaps so important to me, I was no longer a Christian. I decided that I didn't believe in a personified deity at the age of 13. I don't know, I wasn't clever enough to work it out. I just decided I didn't believe it. So by the time I read this book, I'm not a believing Christian, but I realized that I was part of a community that derived its moral codes from that place, and that those moral codes might, some of them, be suspect. So for example, and this is a dangerous topic, sex. That the idea of sex, if you look back into the first 3 centuries of Christianity, there are no prohibitions. Jesus never says anything about it. Paul, who's maybe a bit odd, says it's better to marry than to burn because you'll go to hell if you don't marry. So adultery is against the Mosaic law, the law of Moses. But there are no prohibitions on masturbation. Then you get this saint, and I don't think he was very saintly, called Jerome. And his writings, you know, it's like when Amish people, they sneak away and they read the Bible in English because they don't understand the kind of High German version. So they're told, just as, you know, in the 16th century, people were told the Latin Vulgate, they didn't understand. When people read, the Amish read, there's nothing about which way you crossed your suspenders, apparently, in the Bible. In the 16th century, people found there were no priests, no monks or nuns in the Bible. These are inventions that came much later. And every culture, comes around and asserts its authority and doesn't want you to think too much. We have always lived in authoritarian societies, with two exceptions that I'm aware of. I'm a passionate fan of a sociologist called Eli Sagan. He wrote a book called At the Dawn of Tyranny, which is examining how tribal societies became kingships. So he talks about Uganda, which is where Uganda comes from. He talks about the Homeric Greek, Agamemnon, Menelaus, all of these people. He talks about Hawaii, because they overthrew the taboos. It's their word. It's a spot of ground you can't walk on or they'll kill you. 2 years before Captain Cook went and messed with them. So they were willing to talk about what they believed. So he talks about that. He later writes a book called The Honey and the Hemlock about the original democracy in Athens, where women were kept indoors and had to wear veils, and slaves were kept and only men could vote. And, but it was democracy, hey, which he compares to the original US democracy where women were kept indoors. And
right.
Men kept slaves, but he then moves on to a book called Citizens and Cannibals, where he looks at the French Revolution. And what he's spent a lifetime doing is saying, is democracy possible and how? And it's mind-boggling. You get into this and go, it must be, please. There must be a way that we can learn to collaborate with each other, to settle all of this hatred, and, to go forward to have a lovely environment in which to live by stopping fighting wars and by achieving great things. Yet our society in every generation is mired into warfare, which when you look at it is unnecessary and stupid. In 1958, the CIA report said the US will never be able to stop Ho Chi Minh from taking over Vietnam because the Vietnamese people all want him. Having been oppressed by the Chinese before the French for over a century, the Vietnamese want to be an independent nation and make their own mind up. If you go in there, you'll lose. That was 1958. They were right. It took 17 years to prove them right. And 58,000 American lives lost in the conflict, as many from suicide and Agent Orange poisoning since, and 2 million, perhaps, Vietnamese lives, to drop more munitions than were used in the whole of World War II on a tiny little country to destroy the environment. Why? Why are we that stupid? Why, given our vast brains and our wonderful intelligence, can't we actually work out how to get on together and live with one another instead of creating all of this factioneering and allow people to have whatever opinions they have? I think that some of the cult apologists, the people who, or new religious movement apologists, they're doing what they're doing for the best of reasons, for liberal reasons, because they believe in free will. They believe that everybody can make their own mind up and it's wrong to think that you can influence people. They're misinformed. None of them are psychologists. They're all sociologists or historians of religion. And just to say that Stanley Milgram's experiments were unethical, which they were, doesn't mean they didn't happen. And the criticisms of Zimbardo are frankly pathetic, having gone through them. We do herd together. We are willing, as a species, to murder other human beings and enjoy it and revel in it, the glory of war. It's an aspect of human culture, and we've got to grow up. We've got to mature into something else, because otherwise we're not going to have any grandchildren surviving. We're doing such awful, stupid things. We have such power. And the thing is, we do have the good sense, I'm sure, and the intelligence, even cult apologists, or to sit down. So I sit with them. I had Eileen Barker, who's one of the famous ones. They gave a talk in Manchester, and I thought there were going to be 3 people there. And I walk in the room, and the room's full, and Eileen's in the first row. So this poor woman had to listen to me droning on for 2 hours, and making sure that everybody knew she was in the room. I was polite because I seek to be that, and she's 83 now, but she's been the central pillar of this thing. And I think she's quite genuine. I don't think she's a sociopath. I think that she really thinks she's dealing with human liberty. And I can understand that when Ted Patrick and people came along in the 70s and started kidnapping and abusing members of groups, that they were defending against that. What they're not understanding is you have to look at the whole picture. When somebody tells me that she was on the rehabilitation project force in Scientology, and when she fell pregnant, she was screamed at for 2 weeks to have an abortion. When she refused, she was put on a thing with another pregnant woman where they had to shovel human excrement from a pit into wheelbarrow from one pit into another. I take note. I'm not willing to say, as Gordon Melton does, that the rehabilitation project force is a really good thing. It's, you have to listen to all accounts. If you are going to be fair, by all means, listen to the what current members of a group believe, but listen to the defectors. My work is not cited by academics on the grounds that I used to be a Scientologist. And it's like, well, no, I've got no axe to grind. When Kendrick Moxon, the head of their litigation department, sat me in a deposition, he said, "Do you think you were brainwashed in Scientology?" I said, no. I was hypnotized a bit, but brainwashed, no.
Well, and this is you're absolutely right. All the things you're saying are completely sensible and perfectly belong on my Sensibly Speaking podcast. And I do need to say that, and also reinforce and plug what you're saying there about the academics, because I give them a hard time and I call them scumbags and I call them this and that. And I totally get what you're saying and I get where they're coming from. And I know that you can create a mindset with yourself that you're the justice one. You're the guy who's fighting for human rights, and I get where that viewpoint comes from. I lambaste their intellectual dishonesty because in the series of videos I did reviewing the book Scientology, which was by academics for academics about Scientology, and I broke down chapter by chapter.
Bothering to find out much about Scientology.
Well, that was the thing. As I broke it down chapter by chapter, video for everyone, very extensive video, take quotes, show how every single one of them did nothing but regurgitate Scientology's promotional pieces. Yeah. That's all they do. And they think they're doing something intellectual and helpful. And I have to call it out because they're supporting a destructive group, as you well know. And so I have to say, yes, you're right. And I also have to say to everybody, look, guys, at the same time, let's remember the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Yeah. Everybody thinks they're fighting the good fight. It doesn't mean that they are.
Yeah. And we have to have a certain caution, but let's do it. Let's talk about Gordon J. Melton.
Yeah.
This year I've spoken at poor Eileen Barker, but I've corresponded with both Gordon Melton, who finally 4 emails in answered me, and I thank him for that, and said no, he didn't want to talk about Scientology. I've also been in touch with Massimo Intravini, who is I believe the founder of Xenu, which is the central group to which these people belong. A guy who I exit counseled, I don't know, 1994. He got in touch with me. Yeah, we were in touch up until about 5 years ago and then fell out of touch. But he got in touch with me to say, hey, there's this thing called Kabbalah and it looks great. And look, I found this academic journal, this Xenu journal that says it's great. And I said, yeah. And 4 months ago, they said that my work was a waste of time in a single sentence dismissing me, which was actually written by Massimo Intravini. But Intravini wrote, I thought, a very good piece about the attack upon religious freedom in China. And so I wrote to him and I said, this is a very good piece. And he wrote back a very positive, acknowledgement of that. I would say that where people are fighting for religious freedom, I think that Falun Gong is crazy. I think all the Hsian Taoist, and I'm, okay, I admit it. Since I was 17, I've been reading Taoist texts. It's all public now. Right through Scientology, I always believe that Lao Tzu, Zhang Tzu, and the Buddha and Jesus were much more important than Ron Hubbard. I'm sorry, that was just the way it was. I thought Hubbard had a way of helping people therapeutically to then get ready to go and get enlightened, And if anybody wants to see my current view on enlightenment, there's a video on my channel, which I haven't been plugging hard enough during this conversation. Um, it was great. This guy wrote to me and he said, no, you're wrong about enlightenment. You're just a travel agent. You haven't been there and you're just talking about it. And I said, well, fair enough. What about you? And he said, here's a video of my guru. And it's like, so you've been there, right? But in talking about the Hussian Taoism, the alchemical Taoism, the idea that you can live forever by certain breathing practices and not emitting your own semen, which we don't talk about until you get into the deep levels here, the secret of the golden flower, as it's called, recirculating the chi. I want nothing to do with that, but what's called Zhenglao Taoism, where you look at the texts of Lao Tzu, and I admit you can go and buy my translation of the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. It's true. I've spent over 30 years working with this text, which I think it's a wonderful exploration of thought. It's very easy to take it and then turn it into this nonsense. And it's very easy to take any teaching and turn it into a nonsense. If we come back to Gordon Melton, and we are going to come back to Gordon Melton, his little book, Scientology, is exactly what you say. It is the PR pack of the Church of Scientology, the so-called Church of Scientology, in which he, for example, talks about Ron Hubbard being a blood brother of the Blackfoot Pekuni people. And the only reference he has for this is a letter from a man called Tree Many Feathers. And I mentioned Kendrick Moxon in a deposition earlier. During this deposition, Moxon pushed this paper. He says, you say that he wasn't a blood brother, but here we are. The tribal council of the Blackfoot say he was. And I said, where does it say tribal council on that letter? And he looked and went, oh, you're right, it doesn't. He said, Tree Many Feathers, who signed that letter, was an 8th blood Blackfoot, which means he can just claim membership of the people. An 8th is the minimum. And he said that when interviewed by the LA Times by Bob Welkos and Joel Suppel, who I worked with for 5 years without any credit for what I did, sod the pair of them, thank you very much. But they did do excellent articles, and they interviewed the historian of the Blackfoot, who said we never had blood brothers. They interviewed the deputy chief of the thing, who said we never had blood brothers, and they interviewed Tree Many Feathers, who said, well, there of course aren't any records, so I decided I'd make him a blood brother. And that's Melton's evidence that he was a blood brother. And you're kind of going, that's not really very deep research. Melton also was with James Lewis, who's the editor of the book on Scientology you're talking about, in Japan, in Tokyo, after the sarin gas attacks, which...
Oh my God, this story. Yeah, please tell us.
Where he announces to the press that it's not possible the Dom Shinrikyo, who've paid for them to go there, were involved in
they do this press conference in Japan, right after a sarin gas attack that this cult executed on a number of public people in the metro system of Japan.
13
practically killed tens or hundreds of people. And these two rush off to Japan.
Would have killed thousands of people, but a very brave railway guard, realizing what was happening, evacuated. He lost his life, and 12 others did. Shinrikyo they had a heart surgeon who was murdering people. But it was then, a couple of days or soon after this pronouncement is made, it is not possible. James Lewis and Gordon Melton stand there saying this. They found enough sarin gas to kill 4 million people.
Wow.
And if you talked about the doctrine behind that, which is called POA, and if you watch the video on my channel, we're getting warmed up now, which is called Karma, I talk about POA there. POA is a doctrine, a crazy doctrine in Buddhism, whereby you accelerate somebody's karma. So their idea was they were going to kill everybody in Japan, and then they'd all be happy. They could be reborn. And again, not sure about that.
Just proving once again that people can literally rationalize anything.
Melton was paid as an expert witness for the Children of God, who started systematically abusing children from the age of 3.
That's right.
He was an expert witness for Witness Lee. He wrote about Ramtha in the Church of I Am. When I went to him and said, look, what I'd like to do is to deconstruct your 64-page booklet for Tony Ortega's side, one point at a time, and in the spirit of academic friendship, I will send the piece to you before it's published for your response. And he said, no, thank you. So
Wow.
he also said that he'd longed to write a book about Scientology, but Sister Reitman, as he called Janet Reitman, had taken a box of his material and not returned it. And there were two thoughts about that. One was, why did you give original material away? If you're a scholar, you give their things called copies.
Yeah, it's a Xerox machine.
Yeah, scanners, things like that.
Yeah.
And two, you can't write your book because you're missing a box. My collection on Scientology is 60 bankers boxes basic plus 24 bankers boxes around. So 84 bankers boxes. That doesn't include the several yards of books. So you're missing one box, and you can't write it. You don't have enough material. His argument is, if you've not seen the Scientology archive, you can't write about Scientology. So I wrote to him, I said, that's like saying if you don't have the Kim family's diaries, you can't write about North Korea. He didn't respond.
Yeah, or you can't write about the Catholic Church if you can't go into the Vatican archives, and good luck getting in there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Come on.
So
these guys.
And why hasn't Scientology made those archives available if they will disprove? As yet, my book's been out there since 1990. As yet, nothing in it has been disproven.
That's right.
When Stacey Young read it, she did the so-called dead agent pact dismissing Ben Corridan's book. And she said when she read my book, she couldn't find anything. And she'd been in the archives. And again, I pointed out to Melton that I'd interviewed Jerry Armstrong, who's in the archives, Vaughan, who was the next head of the archives, Stacey, Shiona Fox-Ness, Laurel Sullivan. I had some commerce with all of these people and quite a lot with several. So I'd also, and I hate to admit this, had a friend who had full access to the archives during the researching of Blue Sky, which is why we got the 1938 Skipper letter, which everybody who's been involved in Scientology should read. My only goal is to smash my name into history so hard that if all of the books are destroyed, I'll be remembered. I can make Napoleon look like a punk. I don't believe in immortality, except for the barred note, carved granite, printed word. L. Ron Hubbard, 1938, after writing Excalibur.
I was going to ask you, since we're sitting here gabbing about this, and you brought up archives and you brought up personal connections to archives, I have to ask you this because this has been a sort of back of my mind interest from the beginning.
I may have to charge money for this.
Yeah, you might, but here we go. I've only talked to two people in my entire life coming out of the church who claimed to have actually held or seen or been around in the vicinity of Excalibur. The church claimed to have published one chapter of that book in one of the Ron mags, but otherwise has never said anything about Excalibur one way or the other. Jerry Armstrong is one of those people, and he and I don't really talk at this point, and so I don't know what he did or didn't see about it.
He saw four versions of Excalibur.
Yeah, and the other person I'll leave nameless, but she also didn't really have anything substantive to say about it. I'm curious, what have you heard about it, since it's just this almost mythical lore status, book that nobody's ever really seen except Arthur J. Burks, who wrote about it in the 60s, and that's all we've really got.
And
so I'm curious. Oh, sorry, Forrest Ackerman, not Arthur J. Burks. Forrest Ackerman, yeah. So what did you learn anything new about this in your connections?
There are lots of little bits. Martin Samuels, who was the most successful Scientologist in all history in terms of making money, the Delphi schools, various missions, he said that when he read it, let's give them the myth. In February 1938, Hubbard writes this manuscript, Excalibur, which makes one person freak out and commit suicide.
So Hubbard claims.
Well, yeah,
it's not like we have proof of that.
Well, not only don't we have proof of it, it's absolute nonsense.
Right. Sorry, just had to throw that in there because I needed to fact check that statement immediately.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
But please go on.
Thank you for doing that. It is true that British irony can sometimes make it sound as if, but
Yes, I apologize.
No, no need to apologize. I'm glad that you took it up. People do need to know that this is just a made-up story, that Hubbard wrote this manuscript, which was so scary that he claimed that they'd had to commit suicide as a consequence. I mean, Battlefield Earth made me feel that way, I must say. And he talks about degraded novels in keeping Scientology working, and then writes about the ring of boys with their all joined together and mutated with their bums facing outward. I mean, how degraded can you get? It made William Burroughs, a famous Scientologist, look positively tame by comparison, I thought. But
that's right.
The idea is that he wrote this book, and it revealed some. He said that during a dental operation on nitrous oxide, and this is a very interesting point that's easily missed. If you look back to the nitrous oxide cults of the 19th century, William James, the great William James, in the Varieties of Religious Experience, devotes a chapter to this in about 1901 when he gave the lectures that's based on, that there were people tripping out of their heads on nitrous oxide, laughing gas, still used occasionally in dental operations. And it gives you apparently, not actually, well, I have actually, when I was 8, I had a tooth extracted on it and I hated it. So I've not been tempted to use it again. I don't think it's even an illegal drug. I think it's one of the ones that got missed out. It's still used as a propellant in aerosols. And so you get kids who, get squirty cream and they die because the cream fills their lungs because they're trying to get the hit off the nitrous oxide. So don't try that at home, definitely not. But Hubbard got high enough that he believed he was dead for some minutes. And during that time, a smorgasbord, a Swedish buffet of knowledge, was given to him that he wasn't meant to see. And somebody said, oh no, he's not meant to be here, send him back. Now,
that's right.
This is what's called tripping. And
you think?
Not necessarily a reliable source of scientific information. So he writes this book, and the thing that he finds is that the basic purpose of human beings is to survive. And you're going, wow, you're telling me that which exists needs to exist, or it's not existing. That's a real revelation. I think you'll find Darwin put it rather better when he stole Spencer's phrase, the survival of the fittest, which is to say those that are fittest to survive, not the strongest, not the cleverest, but the ones that are best fitted to this moment. The Nazis got that one a bit wrong too. It takes a bit of interpreting,
I wonder that Hubbard didn't necessarily mean something along those lines when he was, sort of like some phrases and expressions can be dog whistles to racists or, misogynists or whatever. I wonder if Hubbard's had a little. I'm just conjecturing here. I'm not asserting anything, but I'm just wondering whether Hubbard was sort of even maybe dog whistling to himself a little bit because the survive thing. Because when you read about what Forrest Ackerman said about what's in Excalibur, it's weird. It's about power dynamics and it's about controlling people, and it's weird. And he said it's weird reading it. So I'm sorry. Anyway, please go on. But I just wanted to interject.
Kind of squirrely or squirmy is the word he uses. And
yes.
Of course, later in 1949, Tony Ortega, every now and then, Tony will publish something which is a revelation to the public. And I'm going, oh, sorry. I've had that letter since 1985. I don't think about it because I've got just such an enormous collection of material. But thankfully, Tony is there to share these things. As I say, the Skipper letter, everybody should read, the 1938 letter. In 1949, he writes a letter to Forry, and Forry let us have all of his letters. Bless him. It was me who sent the crew to film him as well. I've done wonderful things in my life and not been paid for them. But I will be sending a bill in at some point. But in a 1949 letter published on the Underground Bunker, where you can also find the interview with Forry Ackerman, which came from the Secret Life of Orrin Hubbard, which I worked on in 96, my last contribution to Scientology documentary making, I think, that he says that he's found a way of raping women and they won't even know it happened. He doesn't say, I found a way of helping people at any point. He says, I found a way of making more money than anything I've ever thought of. And that's what he's about. But we're going to go down the rabbit hole now. I'm going to say something that is not said enough and maybe hasn't been said. L. Ron Hubbard Jr., right, born in 1934, the son of the first marriage to Margaret Louise Grubb, Polly, the skipper, to whom the skipper letter is addressed. In 1952, joined his father, and there is much conjecture about this man, Nibs Hubbard, L. Ron Hubbard Jr., and he is often dismissed. I have seen Tony Ortega dismiss him. I've seen Chris Owen dismiss him because he signed writs of perjury. He admitted to perjury. Now, what I would suggest is that if somebody threatened your life and offered you $250,000 to sign a document, you might be tempted. Talking to his son, he said that his father always had a gun behind his back when he opened the door. Nobody was harassed more than Nibs. Paulette Cooper, nobody was harassed more than Nibs. And for 7 years, from 1952 to 59, at which point, he was the immediate deputy to L. Ron Hubbard. 7 years during the development stage. So to dismiss what he said, you have to be very careful with what he said. And there are two lines of what two aspects of his testimony. One is what he experienced himself. And as a historian who's really done a lot of work on this, there are a lot of stories he told that I cannot confirm. I decided that I would not print anything that he said without a confirming source because he'd signed a writ of perjury. But I was able to find that much of what he said, like, for example, the fight that broke out when they came to arrest L. Ron Hubbard during the Philadelphia doctorate course, that other people testified to that. So there's this one strand, which is his experience when he says that he flew cocaine for the mafia, for his father. Maybe. Not impossible. But there's another strand, which is what his father told him and he believed. And part of what there is a book. It is called The Telling of Me by Me. It's the autobiography of L. Ron Hubbard Jr., and it has never been published. And I was the fourth person to read it on the grounds that I would not share the manuscript with anybody, and I never have. I have urged the holder of this manuscript to publish it because I think it utterly vindicates L. Ron Hubbard Jr. And you find out the real L. Ron Hubbard. And it's the only place, because this is the only person who knew him that closely, apart from Mary Sue, who maybe even she wasn't that close because of some of his sexual antics during the 50s. I think maybe she was shut out. So his first experience with his father was is now called Scientology, A History of Man. It was originally called What to Audit. And what happened was that he came into the room and his father gave him a handful of amphetamine pills, which were perfectly legal at the time, and sat him down, bunged him up with speed, and said, okay, what do you remember? Now, in a 2-week period, Mary Sue Hubbard, good name, L. Ron Hubbard Jr. and L. Ron Hubbard took amphetamines in large quantities and produced a book which says that we evolved from clams. This is a cold-blooded and factual account of the last 60 trillion years. How you can record 60 trillion years of history in 2 weeks, I do not know. Just researching Scientology over its years took me 7 years, But
well,
maybe
yeah, but John,
maybe I should have taken some speed, and
But John, they had an e-meter.
Well, yeah.
I mean, come on, they had an e-meter, man. That's all. That was the thing that propelled the whole track memory syndrome, I guess you could say, right? And I'm just joking here, but I'm just,
But you would have the amphetamines would have to have sped you up quite a bit, because 60 trillion years. If you're then having to check everything on the e-meter, I don't think you could do it.
Right.
And it's got the Piltdown Man in it, which is a forgery and all sorts of nonsense. But he goes from there to running the congresses where it was always $500 a ticket. The Philadelphia Doctorate course, 38 people attended it. That was the whole following. By December 1952, he'd gone from 150,000 people reading Dianetics in 1950 to total collapse using his incredible business skills. And he was just picking up people for these little congresses twice a year. And he'd go on stage for 40 minutes, shoot a bullet and say R245 or what have you through the stage, and lays around the rest of the time, writing and writing and writing, because, you know, as UI and Yuval believe, and it was Yuval who suggested it, he probably had temporal lobe epilepsy, which, you know, the first criterion is hypergraphia. You can't stop writing, and he's in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most prolific author of all time. Undoubtedly, Author Services provided 4 or 5 copies of everything, you know, because there are. Oh, this was the, you know, he wrote Introduction to Scientology Ethics 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 editions. The reality is actually that he only wrote 1 book. Do you know this?
Yeah, no, I know. And there's compilation books, and there's this and that. And
yeah,
even if you filter all that out, you are still dealing with 5,000 lectures, thousands of bulletins, thousands of policy letters. I mean, hypergraphia is absolutely a correct label for this man.
Yeah, he just couldn't stop pouring this thing out. But what Nibs does open the door to is, what did Ron Hubbard believe? One of the things in the James Lewis book is that there's nothing to show that Scientology is a magical practice. Well, I beg to differ.
Excuse me? There's nothing in Scientology magical? Did this guy ever look up at what a postulate is?
Or
what is he
for
talking
example,
about?
What an operating thetan is, if not
yeah, all of it. I mean, but come on, man.
What they're trying to say is it's not ritual magic in the sense of Aleister Crowley. But there's a difference between what the creator intends and what the followers do. And, you know, I would absolutely aver, and have been doing for decades, Scientology is a magical ritual.
Absolutely. I mean, auditing is absolutely that.
Yeah. All of the people are the entities, the elementals within the ritual who are being directed to flow power to source.
That's right. That's right. Now, I just want to point out to everybody, just in case they think we've gone radically off subject here, that we are talking about the brainwashing of Nibs.
And we're talking about the man who created the brainwashing system of Scientology and what it's meant to be. And what it's meant to be, as in any brainwashing system, is a way of enslaving and controlling people.
Exactly.
And when it works, you don't notice it. You know, Steve Hassan, I think when I first met him in about 1989, he'd already got this question. You say to somebody, I'm not under mind control. And he'd say, how would you know if you were?
Exactly.
So
it's sharp and pointed questions like that we need a lot more of.
Yeah. The connection that Nibs makes that's very frightening is, he talks about Crowley. He says his father was totally devoted to Crowley. He always kept a copy of the Book of the Law with him. Of course, he refers inaccurately to Magic in Theory and Practice in the Philadelphia Doctorate Course lectures. He refers to the Fool card as having an alligator barking at the heels. Well, only the Crowley pack has an alligator. The rest have a dog. You know, he calls him my very good friend, Aleister Crowley, though, of course, Crowley called him an idiotic lout. But you know, they didn't share the same affection, you might say, and they never actually met. But those elements of Crowley-like magic are very significant. And that Nibs is saying, look, he was terrified of his father. He believed that his father really was the B666 and that he'd opened the door to hell and that he could put anybody in there, you know, and he could screw anybody's head up. And you see the amount of suicides around Hubbard. You know, one of the things that Benjamin Zeller in his paper about brainwashing said is that when he studied Heaven's Gate, only 1% of them committed suicide. So I point out that that's 70 times the national suicide rate in the United States. Sometimes you have to check numbers. And
well, you know, framing is everything when you're talking about this stuff. And you can frame it that way. Only 1%. And then you go, yeah, we're talking about, you know, thousands of people or, you know, whatever it is. But it's, you know, framing. So it's its own propaganda technique.
Hubbard said, when you become too incredible, you become invisible.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a truth. That is a truth. That if you tell people, look, this guy was into Aleister Crowley, he was a sadist who performed sex magic, people are going, oh, yeah, you disillusioned ex-member. I've seen the blood ritual. Omar Garrison had his door kicked in and he flew. He was the official biographer of Hubbard, who had the great hoard of documents from the archive. And he flew to England only to see me. Right?
You met Omar Garrison?
Yeah, he flew over to see me.
I did not know that.
Yep. And he showed me the blood ritual, which had been mentioned in the Armstrong case. And he said, you can't copy it. You can read it. I'm going to tell them that I've shown it to you. And if they try and take the archive back again, I'm going to give it all to you. So I've seen the handwritten document where Hubbard devotes his life to the goddess Hathor. And
wow.
gives of his blood that he will serve the Empress, who is the Scarlet Woman, the Whore of
the
Babylon.
Guardian Spirit.
Yeah. So
that he refers to in his God, my mind always goes dead on these things. Affirmations.
Yes, and Burks talks about it. You mentioned A.J. Burks in his autobiography Monitors. If Hubbard had a guru, Tony tells me I've twice written about this, but A.J. Burks was his guru. And he was ultimately a colonel in the Marines who published 800 pulp stories and believed in monitors, these little beings, the little its, he calls them. And he said Hubbard could see them. And in the redhead, he calls him the redhead in his biography. And he says that Hubbard was never frightened when he was flying an airplane because he could see his guardian angel, a red-haired woman in a green dress on the wing. And that's the Empress. That's Flavia Julia. That's Hathor. That's Diana, Artemis, Dianetics.
Exactly. I was going to make that connection. That's right.
Yeah.
We could probably
we will
do a whole nother podcast on these occult leanings and teachings and stuff of Hubbard, and we should. I have to get us back to the brainwashing. I know my audience right now is like, no, but we really need to discuss that in...
I was just about to tell you the secret.
Okay, come on. But I just want to...
Just one of the connection that Nibs makes, which I think is extremely important.
Yes.
And that is to Hitler.
God, really?
Nibs says, and this is what his father told him. And what I'm saying is, don't believe anything that L. Ron Hubbard said. But he convinced his son that he was given the magic materials by the same man who had given them to Hitler. Now, while I am not aware of any evidence that Hitler was involved in magical practices beyond astrology, which he definitely believed in, we do know without any shadow of a doubt that the deputy leader of the Nazi Party, Rudolf Hess, and the head and founder of the Schutzstaffen, the SS, and the Gestapo, Heinrich Himmler, were both members of the Tula Group, which is a sister organization of Aleister Crowley's OTO. There is no doubt about that. It's historically completely researched. So the notion that there is this bizarre set of ideas that has that went into the Nazis that also went into Scientology is well worth researching. And I would that these academics would spend a little bit of time doing that, because I'm not going to. I'm done with that stuff. I want to help people not get involved with authoritarian, totalitarian groups or into relationships with authoritarian people. I want to defeat authoritarianism in our society. So, those were my interests 30 years ago when I was reading. And there is no doubt. I mean, there's an excellent documentary by Michael Wood, the English historian, who I had the great privilege of spending Christmas with one year, actually, which is yet another batch of stories, but he's a brilliant historian. He did a program about Himmler and Hess and their involvement and shows you that they were into the magic. Nibs was saying his dad boasted that he too was informed by Hitler. Just one little point beyond that. Just one little point beyond that. There is a book called Hitler Speaks, written by a man called Hermann Rauschning, who was the president of the Danzig Senate. After World War I, a corridor was made from Poland to the Baltic Sea that cut through Germany. And the city of Gdansk or Danzig was in that corridor. So it was declared an independent city, and it's the place that the Nazis first came to power. And Hermann Rauschning was the man. He used to go and have dinner with Hitler. He used to spend weekends with Hitler, and he kept careful notes afterwards. And in 1937, he left Germany and came to England, or left Danzig and came to England, because he was terrified by what he'd heard. And he wrote a book published in 1938 called Hitler Speaks. And in it, he said that Hitler had told him that the reason he'd left was that Hitler had said he was going to exterminate the Jews. Just straight on, he was going to kill them all. So forget the Wannsee conference and all of that. And nobody listened to Rauschning, by the way. Nobody did anything about it. But he said Hitler had told him that if you want an organization to function properly, you should look to the Freemasons for levels of initiation. That's your bridge. Yeah.
That's exactly what the bridge is.
Yeah.
That's right.
And that you should look to the Jesuits for the form of your organization. Now, this wouldn't have meant as much to me as it did if it hadn't been that 3 years before I read Hitler Speaks, and I read it in 96 in Cape Town, I was talking to one of the great and hidden researchers who helped me with the book, the hidden Tibetan, no, he's a real human being. And he said to me, Scientology is based upon the Jesuits and the Freemasons. So 3 years later, I'm having one of Hitler's guys say, this is what Nazism is based on. So put that in your pipe and smoke it.
I tell you, man, I'm gonna. That is fascinating. This is the kind of thing that really gets me reevaluating things at a basic level, or at least certain things that I've looked at or conclusions I've made. And I love getting new knowledge and new information and being able to incorporate it.
Yeah.
For example,
I don't actually believe in magic.
Oh no, of course not.
I think it's ridiculous nonsense. But I think as a historian, to exclude what people believed.
Oh no, that's vital to understand their actions.
Exactly.
You cannot understand why somebody acts the way they do if you don't understand why they think the way they do.
Yeah.
I wanted to comment briefly on this, and then I really do want to get back to the brainwashing stuff, although I really do think this is all part and parcel of the same conversation. But
of course,
let me ask,
magic is brainwashing.
Yeah. Let me throw this out there. I have, because I've never talked to you directly about it, I don't think, and that is my supposition about the usefulness and maybe necessity of Mary Sue Hubbard. Because I hadn't factored in nibs, and I was thinking that when Hubbard was a con man, Hubbard was a pathological liar, and Hubbard was extremely poor most of the time. He spent money as fast as he got it. Of course, this is all according to Russell Miller's biography, right?
Yeah, well, Russell's book is based on mine, and I was his researcher. I'm going to
right.
So we interviewed many people, and the same phrase kept popping up. He spent money like water.
Right. And so what changes in 1952, 53 that suddenly he's not doing that all of a sudden, right? Because he changed. Something changed. He started forming an organization and building it, not tearing it apart, like he had with Dianetics. 1950 and 1951 is a character study of how to destroy a grassroots movement that is doing nothing but supporting every single thing you say and think, right? Hubbard had the world was his oyster, right? He had it all. And he had people like hanging on his every word all through 1950 and 1951. And then he tanks the entire thing, bankrupts it because he just can't stop spending money like water. And I've often wondered what changed that Phoenix was able to happen, and and Washington D.C. was able to happen, and eventually he builds up this international organization, and St. Hill happens, and then it becomes truly, out of control. And my thinking was always that Mary Sue, who he said in many lectures was his organizational backbone, she was the one who could come along and whip up the auditors, get everybody into production, get things going, get organization going. He bragged about how Mary Sue would do this over and over again through his lectures. And so it made me think, she might have been the organizational, I don't want to say organizational genius, but certainly the influencer who calmed him down enough with his rampant spending and out of control, flagrant violations of the law and stuff. I sort of thought, only based on the information that we have, that perhaps she was a civilizing, calming influence on him in some fashion. I don't want to overstate that, but enough to build an organization.
Yeah, I'm going to rip your supposition apart. I'm sorry.
Please do. So now Nibs comes in, and now I'm thinking, well, how much of an influence was he, et cetera, et cetera. So go.
Let me start with a statement about Mary Sue Hubbard.
Yes.
During his campaigns, early on, before he led the Communist Party, Mao Zedong made a feint attack upon the town where his second wife, his first wife, had died, and his 2 young boys lived. And then he left. So he left his wife and his 2 young children to be taken by the nationalists. And his wife was asked, will you renounce communism? And she said, yes. She was asked, will you renounce Mao Zedong? And she said, no. And she was executed. Mary Sue Hubbard is pretty much the same. There's a story, there are a few of them. On the ship, she would often have screaming rages with Hubbard. And he, during one of these, said, look, she said, you're a charlatan. This is absolute, it's a scam. What are you doing? And he said, what do I have to do to persuade you? And she said, I've never been exterior. I have to go exterior. So poor Otto Rose, who was the equivalent of the senior case supervisor, Hubbard said, right, find every exteriorization process I've ever written and run them on Mary Sue until she goes exterior. And in the end, after a few weeks, Mary Sue said, no more. So she did not believe in communism, Scientology, whatever. She believed in Ron. So that's the relationship. I've talked with senior Hubbard aides. I have a very close friend who said he hated Hubbard. He couldn't be near him. All of the screaming, all of the bullying. When I found out about that, it's like my notion is of the Buddha, of a calm person. When I found that out about Hubbard, I knew it was wrong. A bully, you don't need to be that. Mary Sue could go around and calm people down afterwards. That was her virtue. In terms of organization, what happened was that by the end of 1950, Hermitage House, Artsepos, the publisher, had turned around to Hubbard and said, I'm not printing any more of this book because it's a scam. So that was the first collapse. The second was John Campbell Jr., running Astounding, the very influential man who really did have the qualification in physics, unlike Hubbard. He said, it's nonsense. I had a remission of my asthma and now it's back again. They, of course, were audited using deep hypnosis as well. The technique was changed during the writing of Dianetics, and there were no pre-clears on whom the reverie, according to Don Rogers, who was there and who I interviewed. The letters he sent, I've given to Tony and he's put up. And Joe Winter, who wrote about it. They were the only people who were there. So 5 organizations were made. They were run by other people. He spent the money. Then he steals Alexis and runs off to Cuba with Richard DeMille. And Sarah has a psychiatrist pronounce him mad. And that's when his war on psychiatry begins. 2 of the foundations, I believe, were run by psychologists. So there was no...
Oh, no, that is new information to me.
Okay.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So there was...
Because I thought he was bagging on psychiatry earlier than that. That's interesting. I guess I'd have to dig that up. Interesting. Okay. All right. Yeah.
He writes abnormal Dianetics to send it to the...
Yes.
Yeah, he's trying to be accepted.
That's right. That's right.
And a variety of people, Carl Rogers and Fritz Perls, both wrote positive comments about Hubbard, not having studied any of his work. But Perls actually seems to be taking bits of Scientology, which in turn Hubbard had taken from elsewhere. Then you get Don Purcell coming into the picture, who is a super wealthy oil man in Wichita.
This is in Wichita, Kansas.
And he builds an organization, and it continues for several years, but because of the bankruptcy of the Elizabeth Foundation, he says, look, I'll take on the responsibility, Ron. And so Hubbard sells him the word Dianetics, the existing foundations, the book DMSMH for $1. And he goes in, Purcell goes into court, and for $800, if I remember rightly, the judge gives him, says, okay, you've bought out of the bankruptcy. So Hubbard no longer owns Dianetics, and he now, in February 52, has to invent something. So,
Theta, the tone scale, and all that leads to Scientology.
Yeah, all of which comes from Aleister Crowley or from other existing sources. The tone scale's been around for a while. And the idea of the four humours. I mean, he does mention it in Dianetics, but it is just the four humours of Garland's and medieval medicine. Really, it's not a new idea. But he's got to package it a new way because he's got nothing to sell. From then until probably 1964, he really doesn't make any money. He travels around the English-speaking world, and he manages to get these $500, so as I say, the Philadelphia Doctorate course, there are 38 people. That's it. That's all he can get. And that's because Helen O'Brien organized it with John Neugebauer. And she writes, for me, the most poignant book about Scientology, Dianetics in Limbo, which is just heartbreaking. The experience she had with Hubbard and what her husband ended up killing himself because of the promises that Hubbard had failed to fulfill, one of many over the years. But there never is that much of an organization. There never is that much money. When he buys St. Hill in 1959, he's stretched everything to the limit to do it. I think it cost £18,000 or something because the Maharaja of Jaipur was tired of it. I'm tired of it. It's a horrible building. It's an awful place. It's just grey and dull and boring. And the castle, oh, come on. And there are squirrels.
Well, this is very interesting because I had a different impression of life through the 50s. I thought the 50s were an affluent period, so I was wrong about that.
He manages to buy a Jaguar car.
He manages to tour Europe for months in 1952
Goes on
with
holiday,
Mary Sue.
Rajneesh had 90 Rolls Royces, not one Jaguar.
Yeah, I get it. I know he's not rich. I just thought that he was
people for money, but he's a scam artist. He's not. The big money starts in the 60s.
Okay.
Because of the Anderson inquiry. The thing that promoted Aaron Hubbard was not a management system. It was the media all around the world going, this thing's really scary. The amount of people I talked to over the years who joined because he said he's into black magic.
I know, it's kind of scary, isn't it? You think, okay, we're going to warn you guys. We're going to set you up so that you don't fall for this. And you tell them best, and then they go, oh, yeah, that's all the reasons I want to join. You're just like, what are you, nuts? Anyway, yeah. Oh, sorry. Carry on.
So, I mean, my understanding is that the organization, only with the Sea Org in the late 60s, does the money start to roll in, and that is I'm going to push back a little bit there, only because while at St. Hill, before the Sea Org even existed or was a glimmer in his eye, the IRS was investigating, and they revoked tax exemption because of annulment. Hubbard was making bank by that point, and that was 67 that they yanked. That was before the Sea Org. But that to me looked like the impetus for skipping town and going up and starting the Sea Org was partly because the government was like, yeah, no more tax exemption. We're coming after you, and England was banning people. I mean, it was getting serious. Yeah, and Hubbard went, okay, I'm out of here. But I thought he was rolling in it at that point. No, the annulment, it runs into millions. I'm not saying he was poverty stricken, but nothing like, say, Mahesh. Mahesh, he's left, I think there's 8 billion. They call him Maharishi. Sorry, I am not going to call him great teacher. That's just wrong. It's like calling Rajneesh Bhagwan or Supreme God. It just doesn't work for me, or Acharya, teacher. His name
I'm totally okay with that. That's fine. I get it.
So Mahesh,
I agree with you that Hubbard was definitely not rolling in massive bank yet, and that definitely when the C word came around and international trafficking started and all kinds of other nonsense that he got involved in, that real big money started happening. So, okay, I'm tracking with what you're saying.
Organizationally, you can look at each place and you'll find the individuals who collected the money. If you go to Australia or South Africa, the two places where you'll find that in the Johannesburg, and that's why, of course, he gets very upset and invents the Joburg, because the Johannesburg security check, because the people who are making him the money leave.
Oh.
I think it's Peter Hemery in Australia.
Right, he called them out by name, didn't he? He
and they are to be R245 if you see them. They are to be murdered if you see them.
He was pissed. R245 is a 45 handgun.
Yeah,
it's a joke of a process that's not a joke. He literally means he wants these people killed.
So
wow,
there's that digression. By the 70s, because he did have some people around him who were really canny, some of whom I'd rather not name because they're friends of mine and they don't want to be named anymore. But people like Alex Sibursky,
yes,
not a friend of mine, who. I believe when he was declared suppressive, he was told he had to sell something like 100,000 copies of Dianetics, and he did it. There were these people. They were salesmen, which is, again, there are names I don't want to mention at this point because, I mean, I can think of one guy who went bankrupt 3 times, and during his 3rd bankruptcy, he was boasting to me how you move money to your wife, how you max all your credit cards, how you. These are people who knew about how to make money I tell you, Sibursky is a good example. The Battle of Britain, as it was called, in 1974, summer of 1974, just 6 months before I joined. Sibursky took people and put them in a marquee and wouldn't let them leave without signing what were called postulate checks.
Right.
And these were post-dated checks for a certain amount. And he collected a huge amount of money, but he lost half of the membership in the UK.
That's right. And Hubbard then canceled postulate checks, right?
Yeah.
How dare you? I never authorized this. This wasn't what we wanted you to do.
No. And what I found out through interviewing people was I interviewed a Diana Hubbard aide who said, well, it was actually Diana who told Berserksky, as he used to be called, to do this. So he was acting on orders. And then I found somebody else who'd heard Hubbard telling Diana to do it.
Okay, well, there you go. I mean, it's not the first time Hubbard threw everybody else under the bus for his mistake. I'm just pointing out that happened, Excuse me.
Yep.
It is really something. There's so much of this to get into.
You're gonna have to extract this section and use it elsewhere. Right?
Well, I almost could, but I'm not going to because this is so fucking fascinating. I'm going to keep all this up, and I really want people to see how
you just swore. You swore on television.
I did. I get to do that on my channel.
Wow.
I don't think any 12-year-olds.
Mine is only.
I'm not living in fear that a bunch of 12-year-olds are going to come watch my channel.
Well, a bunch of 12-year-olds can actually quote South Park at you.
Yeah, exactly.
You've got to worry about.
All right, let's get back to brainwashing because I actually would. We've been talking for a while, and this is really good stuff. So I'm obviously going to keep all of this, but I do want to get back to the main theme. And
yeah, me too.
Okay, I want to just take up one other thing that is commonly used, and again, I say commonly used because I literally found it on Wikipedia. Find it around. I've read all of this stuff before, seen all of this in different forms, in academic papers and in articles and media articles. You see that where they just kind of reconstitute this idea, and that is in 1956, after re-examining the concept of brainwashing following the Korean War, the U.S. Army published a report. I have a copy of this thing. I've gone through it. Entitled Communist Interrogation, Indoctrination, and Exploitation of Prisoners of War, which called brainwashing a popular misconception, quote unquote. Again, this is 1956. The U.S. Army busts this thing out. And they say, quote, exhaustive research of several government agencies failed to reveal even one conclusively documented case of brainwashing of an American prisoner of war in Korea, it says. Now, what I want to ask you is, how did they redefine the term brainwashing so no one was ever brainwashed? How did they say this? Because this is definitely not true.
The central allegation made by American prisoners of war in radio broadcasts from North Korea in 1951 and 52 was that they were aware of a germ warfare program against North Korea. And such allegations were made. It could be suggested that there was something other than brainwashing that had led these people to say it. But there are only two ways you can go with this. Either they had knowledge of this and were telling the truth, or they had been coerced in some way into inventing these stories. This is where things get kind of murky, because there is evidence that flies in cluster bomb units carrying diseases were dropped by the US Air Force on North Korea. Now, if you wanted to cover that up, then you can go in several directions. How trustworthy are US government reports? Well, we were told, for example, when Osama bin Laden was killed, he wasn't captured. It was actually an illegal operation in a foreign country. He wasn't tried. So one could say when Osama bin Laden was murdered, and I'm not saying he didn't deserve it, the media were told by US government sources, backed up by the president, that the enhanced interrogation techniques, the torture, was how they had found out his location. The truth is, they'd found it out through cell phones. So, how reliable a source and how exhaustive are the investigations without seeing what those investigations were? I mean, I would thoroughly recommend Dominic Streetfield's book, Brainwash, because it's a great book. And he seems to be quite confused. He seems to be saying, well, brainwashing doesn't work. And then at the end of the book, he's got a chapter on interrogation, which does. Now, right. Sorry, you can't separate the two things. POWs, Edgar Schein and Margaret Singer, of course, studied the POWs coming back, and their exhaustive investigation led them to believe very much that these people certainly were subjected to certain techniques. That there were Turkish prisoners of war, and it was said not one of them gave a broadcast. Right? So why was that? Why were the Americans willing to do it and the Turks not? Well, there could be a reason. The Koreans didn't have any Turkish-speaking people. But if you spoke English, they'd got people who could talk to you. So it's a very difficult place. There's a brilliant documentary about one of the Americans who stayed there. And it was made, I think, in the early 1990s. And a few of the prisoners of war decided not to go home. And he'd lived there all of that time beyond and said, no, it's a great regime. I love it. But I didn't find him very convincing, I must say.
Wow.
So totally untrustworthy source. And yes, another source would be, if we wanted to go sideways, Sun Myung Moon, the founder of the Unification Church, the Moonies. He spent 3 years in a prison camp in North Korea. He then ran a program in 1954, I think, called Victory Over Communism, which was a camp that used the techniques that he reckoned had been used on him, which are the Chinese techniques, to convert people away from communism. He then, with a man called Bo Hai Pak as his second in command, set up the Unification Church. Bo Hai Pak, this is not conspiracy theory, was a colonel in the Korean Central Intelligence Agency. He's not the only KCIA officer to be a member of the top level of the Unification Church, which of course has gun factories all over the world, as any good religion these days does. You've got to protect yourself, against these non-believers. So the interweaving and the deception that has gone on Also, of course, at the same time that this is being issued, you can't do this, it's never been done. Programs are being run on thousands of people in Canada under Ewan Cameron, who was the first president of the World Federation of Mental Health and was wiping people's memories through sensory deprivation and electroshock. Can't be done. Can't be done. 2,000 people, I think they say, were given the drug BZ, which is now classified as chemical warfare. And it's said to be 100 times stronger than LSD. I'm not sure how you measure that. This is, LSD is 7. But it's like, and it's a 4-day trip and it never leaves your system, unlike LSD, which Aaron Hubbard said, you can get rid of through sweating. Well, no, LSD can't stay in your system. It's water-based. Sorry.
Exactly. Exactly.
Sorry.
But this stuff wasn't.
BZ,
I have another connection here I want to throw out. Yep. Also on this, in terms of reinforcing what you said about an unreliable source with the government, because these are also the exact same people, the United States government, the CIA specifically, in the early 1950s starts MK Ultra, and we all know about that.
Well, the very first program was started, I believe, in 1947 in U.S. Navy intelligence, and it's called Bluebird. Okay. And that again, Hubbard in Science of Survival, published in 1951, talks about government agencies using pain drug hypnosis. As far as I know, that's the first time until 1975 that anyone, it's the only mention of the program, which led Lawrence Wollersheim and I both to think, is Scientology actually one of the programs of the intelligence agencies? Is it a mass control program? We both speculated about that. I don't think it is, because they wouldn't have used somebody like Hubbard. I think it's because of his association with Robert Heinlein, who did have access, top secret clearance, and probably knew about this program. And I'm told, and I haven't seen this, according to Heinlein's diaries, not only did Hubbard have sex with Mrs. Heinlein, she had sex with Mr. Heinlein too. So they were intimate. And he may have shared some pillow talk with Ron, which is why this 1951 book presages, the release of information by more than 2 decades. So the first program is before Communist China is established. It's not because of the Chinese, it's because of the Russians. Because of the the show trials of the 1930s and the belief that the Russians, Cardinal Minzenki comes into this, but that's a very complicated other story. They believe the Russians have got something.
So the actual earlier beginning on this whole thing isn't Korea or China, it's Russia.
Yeah.
Which, of course, as we mentioned earlier, completely funding China's revolution from the beginning to the end.
Yes.
This was a time period which is different than now. We have to contextualize this a little bit because this is a post-World War II, like immediately post-World War II, Cold War situation where Russia is, well, in some ways similar, but much, much, much worse than how things are now.
Russia has just invaded most of Eastern Europe.
Right.
It's taken Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany. It has influence in Yugoslavia and Albania. And of course, the Korean War starts because the US decides that it will give half of Korea to the Soviets. So a deal is struck. Two guys spend half an hour, 2 American military guys spend half an hour in a room with a map and decide on the 38th parallel. That's how they came to it. And so a deal is made, we'll have the South bit, you'll have the North bit. The poor Koreans, who've been enslaved by the Japanese for 35 years, don't get any of it.
That's right. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that, it's not necessarily all nefarious and horrible and awful intentions that were behind some of these programs or some of this work. These were people who were facing a new enemy, Russia, having just come out of World War II. You got to get the mindset. This was a very different time than the time we're living in right now, as far as threats and ideas and also technology. There's no internet. There's none of that stuff. And it's hard for people to contextualize what life was like before the internet. For those of us who lived before it, we understand it. But people who don't, I mean, you really got to understand the life is very different without the internet, and a lot of other things. And so here's this new looming world threat, as you just mentioned. They're literally invading countries, and America's looking at this and going, "Well, shit, we just bailed Europe out of this whole thing. We got our asses kicked. We had to drop some nukes on Japan to get them to knock it off, and now." We're facing a new threat, and it's called this Cold War, where we're not going to fight a hot war. Nobody wants that. We're too exhausted. The entire world is too exhausted to do that. So now we're going to fight this Cold War, and we see these people who capture our soldiers, and they turn them against us. They turn them. They make them into little Russians, and we're like, what? What? How does that happen? How are we going to do that? How do they do that? And they want to figure that out. And then things just kind of get out of control. That's how I kind of see it. I don't know. What do you think?
There is something darker behind it, which as you look back into the 1920s and 30s in the US, you have the anti-socialist, anti-communist campaign. You have people like Huey Long, the dictator of Louisiana, as he's called in his own time. You have Charles Coughlin, the Church of the Little Flowers, who has the largest radio audience ever achieved in the world. So I read. It was said that you could walk through New York City on a Sunday from one end to the other on a summer's day without missing a single word of Coughlin's sermon, because if the windows are open, there were that many people. When you read Coughlin, you'll find that L. Ron Hubbard's oratory is based very much on Coughlin. He's a Catholic priest who ultimately is banned by the Pope from speaking because he's so pro-Hitler. This is a time when you have Madison Square Gardens completely filled with the Nazi rally. You can see
this is post-World War II?
No, this is in the late 1930s.
Sorry. Okay,
what's happening is you already have a terrible fear of what is happening. And then you have the reality of what's happening. The war didn't get very cold. In 1945, 1.5 million Russian troops move into Manchuria. And there are historians who would argue that that's why Japan surrendered, because they realized they didn't have a chance against that. You've got the expansion of Russia into Europe, and you have one of the worst people in all of history, Yosif Jugashvili, Stalin, the man of steel. We only know him by his nickname. He's moved a whole population of his home country out to get his revenge on them, the Ossetians. They're all moved out. He has killed perhaps 11 million people directly, and he has overseen a country where perhaps 27 million people have died. And he is on the rampage. For a bit of light relief, the film The Death of Stalin by Armando Iannucci is a comic masterpiece, but it is not inaccurate in describing the day that Stalin died and the terror inflicted by him. So you have Michael Palin of Monty Python and other fame playing Molotov, who is told that his wife is on the hit list to be executed. And he's basically saying, well, if Comrade Stalin said, then it must be right. It must be, she should be killed. And this kind of bizarre situation that's happening in Russia, and the fear of the domino theory. If one country goes, then the others will go. So it's not a Cold War in Korea. You've got the Chinese army and the US army and the British army, the Australians, various other people, all in a terrible war. You've got the Inchon campaign under MacArthur. MacArthur is arguing that nuclear arms should be used against China. And in the end, President Truman basically pulls him out because he can't stop him. And he still keeps saying publicly, let's nuke them, So there's a very hot war going on, and the casualties are massive. There are hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of people die in this war, which is being kept quiet by the media. So the notion that the other side, Russia and China, has a psychological weapon that you don't have. It's like when they got into trying to use dolphins to plant mines on ships and things because they thought the Russians doing it. like the spoon benders, where they actually really did have psychics seeking to guide missiles in the first Iraq campaign, which is, oh, come on, guys, which also came out of Scientology, but that's another story. They thought the Russians were doing it. Their psychics could do it. So you get this kind of craziness that is actually based in sense. If the Russians do have something, we need to stop them, because, I mean, as late as 1961, the concept of leaderless resistance, which is now being used by Al Qaeda and ISIS, don't call us, just go and kill some people. That was developed by a US Army colonel in 1961, absolutely convinced that the communists were just about to take over America. So everybody needed to be ready to fight back, but not talk to each other about it, so they'd never be able to catch you. Go and blow up some commies. So you've got this fervor, which is actually, I agree with you, based upon a very real threat. What was not understood in the Kennedy period is that the USSR had nothing like the arms. So it was being said they had 500 missiles when they had 4. It was only in 2000 that it came out that there were Russian nuclear submarines with nuclear torpedoes in Cuban waters at the time of the crisis. And that if the commanders of the American ships had not let them go, they would have fired those torpedoes into US cruisers and sunk them, and there would have been World War III. So yeah, pretty tense things going on here. And and the darn Ruskies developed their own atomic weapons, their own hydrogen bomb,
and this is also, and then there's 1950s, and there's McCarthyism and social unrest and civil rights unrest in the late, all through, especially late 50s and then into the 60s. And I mean, this, I'm not a historian, so I only have, a layperson's understanding of the historical events and the research I've done to nail down specific events, but your knowledge here is encyclopedic compared to mine, which is why I love talking to you about this stuff.
Well, thank you.
And well, no, I mean, for real. I mean, you remember the dates and the names way better than I could have. You have a knowledge of this stuff the way I used to have a knowledge of where L. Ron Hubbard's quotes were.
Yeah,
I could give you name, title, page number, paragraph number of certain quotes and stuff.
Hammer out of existence, incorrect technology.
That's, well, yeah, and I took all that shit seriously, but it's been harder. It's been harder over the years to keep that steel trap memory with the amount of knowledge I keep shoving into this box here.
It surprised me when I came back after 17 years away from this subject, completely away from it, that so much of it was still in there.
I know, it's amazing.
But I don't think there's any limit to the memory. I don't think it's like a bucket that can overflow. I think we, some of us are frankly lucky, and others aren't. And there are a lot of things that you can do to your memory that will make it worse. And
yes,
I don't do those things.
Okay, fair enough. I might do those things sometimes.
I think most people do.
Yeah, I do. It's its own thing. Okay, let me ask you this. We've talked quite a bit about this, actually, and we might have already answered this question or covered this topic well enough. Just in terms of moving toward wrapping this up, in terms of talking about brainwashing, we have definitely debunked the debunking as to why it's not a thing, doesn't work, didn't work, won't work. We know now, covering all this history and territory, that's total horseshit, and in fact probably just PR from the government to cover up the fact that they've got all kinds of things that they can use to manipulate people. You throw Cambridge Analytica in the digital world on top of this, and it becomes so terrifying, I don't even want to... Actually, I can't really even start thinking about it without getting very overwhelmed. So I don't really want to go there right now. So I guess what I'd like to do is maybe address if there's anything more to say about the apologists. You and I are covering a lot of territory here. Are these people who, we've covered intentions in terms of, You know, some of these academics believe in religious freedom. They should believe in religious freedom. I believe in religious freedom. I just don't believe in religious freedom to abuse people. And this is where my problem with the academics comes in, is they are helping these groups to further abuse and harm people, and in many cases even kill people. And this is where my teeth start gnashing, you know, about my frustrations about these people. As well-intentioned as they might be, they're still doing it wrong.
Yes.
Is there anything further to say about that from your end?
Yeah. One of the great transitions is this word cult that's upset people so much. It had no pejorative meaning up until 1977 in the Oxford English Dictionary. And let me explain that. The Oxford Dictionary, since its inception in the 19th century, I believe you have to have 400 uses before they will accept a new meaning for a word. So up until 1977, and I have the book right beside me, there is no pejorative meaning. The word cult comes from, it's the same as cultivate or culture. It means to grow, it means to worship or devotion. And in the 1977 edition, it reads, devotion to a particular person or thing, now especially as paid by a body of professed adherents. So people who profess belief. That's it. Nothing negative at all. That meaning, they actually date it back to 1711. Then it changes its meaning. It starts to become pejorative or negative in its meaning. And that starts in America. There are even dictionary entries before the Oxford. The Oxford saying there haven't been 400 uses, and they're scouring newspapers and books all the time to find uses. So I think the American Heritage is the first dictionary that starts saying, and it's a group you don't like. So it's a very accurate term, a group that pays devotion to a particular person or thing and an adherent to a group, a cult member, the cult of personality, what have you. The academics have given us, sociologists particularly, have given us this expression. In fact, I think Gordon Melton, who's a historian of religion, in fact, is credited with the term new religious movement. Now, when I had poor Eileen Barker sat in front of me in July in Manchester, I pointed out that I don't have any problem with new religious movements. I think it's an incredibly imprecise term. New, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, means since the 18th century millenarian movements. And according to Eileen Barker, means since the 1950s. According to Benjamin Zeller, he says new is a slippery concept. It isn't a slippery concept. You know, it means new. So they're not new. Who cares whether they're new or not? Let's throw that word away. Religious, well, they classify groups like Erhard Seminar Training, Forum, Landmark Trust, Lifespring, multi-level marketing schemes. They're classified as new religious movements, so they have no religious thing. A movement means more than one person. So you're left with a very imprecise term. But I said, I'm happy with that. I would rather that it was called an alternative belief system, because that's accurate and it doesn't need to be religious and what have you. But okay, they're not going to follow me. That's okay. But let's separate out. Most new religious movements are relatively harmless. There's no danger in them. Who cares that people want to believe that, you know, we all derive from pumpkins and one day we'll glow in the dark. And the earth is only a little bit curved and egg-shaped. I don't care. It's what people do that bothers me. What about we add a word to the beginning of it? Authoritarian new religious movements. And the problem is that by slipping into language, and Benjamin Zeller in his, you know, he finished off his paper, I've got it up in front of me. He finished off his paper by saying it's a matter of language. He says, scholars of new religious movements have shown that the mythology of cultic mind control is more rhetoric than reality. It's easy to understand why critics of the president dismiss him as a cult leader and his political followers as brainwashed. But it says a lot more about the power of language than it does the president himself. Now, My response to that is, of course, with this statement, Zeller dismisses the work of scholars, including, but far from limited to, Robert J. Lifton, Edgar Schein, Janja Lalich, Philip Zimbardo, Alan Shefflin, Stephen Kent, Robert Cialdini, Anthony Prakonis, Margaret Singer, Louis Jolyon West, Benjamin Zablocki, Rod and Linda Dubrow-Marshall, Michael Langoni, Daniel Shaw, and Alexandra Stein. But his last sentence can be refashioned to describe his own paper. It says a lot more about the power of language than it does about the book he has yet to read or the concepts he so eagerly and erroneously dismisses. Language proves that there's such a thing as brainwashing, because by using a term, I mean, I've got him right here and everybody should read him. Frank Luntz, Words That Work, the basic propaganda module. This guy now works for Trump. He's worked for the Republican Party for a long time, but Senator John Kerry, who is not a fan of the Republicans, says Frank Luntz understands the power of words to move public opinion and communicate big ideas. Any Democrat who writes off his analysis and decades of experience just because he works for the other side is making a big mistake. His lessons don't have a party label. The only question is, where's our Frank Luntz? Now, if Hillary Clinton had read this book, she would have become president, because the horrible reality is that we react to words below the level of thinking. It's called snarl words and purr words. So if I say appeasement, that's a snarl word, but it only means negotiation. Right? If I say fascist, that's a snarl word. It means somebody who doesn't believe in democracy. If I say democracy, that's a purr word. And some people have purr words and snarl words like libtard, for example, which belong to their group, and they become thought-terminating cliches, as Robert J. Lifton says, which is an aspect, oh yes, of brainwashing. That we cannot think, and George Orwell points this out in the appendix 1984, which is a rubbish book, I think. He didn't rewrite it. I love George Orwell. His other books are beautifully written. That book he didn't have time to redraft because he died. But the appendix, so the book itself, I think is very badly written. The ideas are interesting. The appendix about language is mind-boggling, because he's saying, if you don't have the words, you can't think it. Now, that's where we've gone, and that's information control in the extreme, where you can no longer think the thing. So if I say brainwash instead of saying undue influence, which is the legal term for the last 500 years for brainwashing, it's absolutely accepted that you can coerce somebody into changing their mind. In this country, since 2015, we've had a law called coercive control, and there have been many prosecutions. It's only in intimate relationships, but where it's accepted that one person can completely psychologically dominate another. There's no force, there's no threat of force even, but they can dominate the person. The work of Evan Stark in the US has really pointed that up, saying, it's not about battered wives or indeed battered husbands. It's about coercive control. It's about a situation where you don't make the decisions. That's the situation in any tyranny. And so, of course it exists. It exists in universities where professors are forced to write so many papers and articles every year, whether they have any meaning or not. A terribly unfortunate effect of modern education, where Yuval Law, who we've mentioned a couple of times, my dear friend, he said the sea squirt. The sea squirt is an animal that in the larval form floats around in the sea, and then it attaches to a rock and goes into the adult stage. And the first thing it does is eat its own brain. And Yuval has said...
That's right. I heard about this one.
PhDs are like the larva, and then they find a university and attach. And
that is a great analogy.
He's full of them, I tell you. He's
a great analogy, according to every academic and professional in academia that I've talked to or interacted with, and I have friends.
I used to be so intimidated. Like. When I first came to this business in my 20s, there were these professors, and I find myself talking with them about their subjects. So I remember talking to a professor of theology and saying, why is it that priests are called father, pastor, when Jesus in Matthew 23 says, call no man on earth your father? And he looked at me and he said, it doesn't mean that. And
that is awesome. I love stuff like that.
That's been my experience so many times that it, when you talk about, the determinism and functionalism and postmodernism,
oh my God.
Everybody's opinion is worth everybody else's. My thoughts about gravity are just as good as Einstein's. Obviously, these mad things like things like Antifa, where it's like, we hate fascists so much that we're going to go and beat them up.
Right? My point. I talk about this all the time, and people push back on this. Like, I talk about brainwashing. Jesus.
Exactly.
Antifa just really riles me up. Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
The word cult is in the word culture, and I wrote a book called Opening Minds, which is meant to show how this happens throughout society. That it isn't like there are these religious cults and these commercial cults. We think in a certain way, and we become cultic in our behavior. Our governments are most certainly cultic. They are desperate. You've got Bolsonaro in Brazil and Trump in the US telling us that global warming isn't happening. And then you've got the thermometer that's telling us that it is. Or as Groucho said, who would you rather believe, me or your own eyes? I've
right.
looked into the research on climate change and global warming, and it's happening. The only argument has ever been, why is it happening, and can we slow it down?
Yeah, exactly.
The argument became, are we making it happen? Which is irrelevant. Can we?
I know. But I want to be careful. I want to be cautious here, and I need to push back a little bit on something here, or maybe not push back, but just maybe clarify a little bit, because
absolutely.
I resist, and I think it can. I think because it's an invitation to sloppy thinking, and I'm not saying you're intending to do this. I'm saying that, people get easily confused, and they're so used to in thought-stopping cliches and propaganda and receiving it from all ends all day long, especially with social media, that I try to avoid going into a place where we're going to start saying or thinking everything is a cult.
Well,
do you know what I mean?
Let's just say there's a spectrum of everything, and you are somewhere or other on the spectrum. With brainwashing, at the far spectrum is terror, force, violence, and at the mild end, there's conversation. With influence, I remember many years ago, a conversation where somebody was telling me that all influence is bad, that people are just trying to persuade other people of their own perception. I'm going, education. I know that much of education is just trying to make people obedient and fill their heads with facts, which is useless, frankly. That we need the skill of how to act, knowing what to do, not knowing that the Battle of Waterloo was in 1815, or that the manumission of slavery was in 1863. I'm the kind of guy that remembers those kind of things, but I'm also the kind of guy that thinks they're irrelevant. What's relevant is, can I see what's in front of me? It's like the case Louise Ogborn, who there are 2 movies about now, who was basically sexually abused while an assistant at a McDonald's. And Compliance, one of the movies is called, and it's got Dereem Weaver in it, I think she's called. And she's basically, a guy phones up and says, I'm a cop, and gets the manageress to get this poor young woman to take her clothes off in the back of the store. What is fascinating to me is that one guy was actually convicted of rape. The guy that did it over the phone, nobody could get. And he'd done it 80 times before, successfully. I think it's that many. What fascinated me about it was that it was only the janitor, the guy who'd not graduated from high school, who walked into the room and said, this is wrong. So he'd not been brainwashed, if you like. He'd not been educated into believing it. He could see it as it was. Had a dear friend many years ago who said the wisest guy he'd ever met was an illiterate shepherd, that he'd never been poisoned by anybody else's thinking, and he'd thought his way through to a way of life, that was happy and peaceful and, didn't get in the way of anything. So I think stuffing people full of facts and information, I just happen to have that kind of head. It's my misfortune in life to live with it. But yeah, everything's a spectrum. Where are we on that spectrum? And so cult and culture, foot binding in China was part of their culture for 1,500 years. If we are rational, if we are open-minded, which means willing to listen to other arguments. I mean, key text on liberty, John Stuart Mill. It's not difficult. It's less than 90 pages. And he says it all in, 1859 or something. When an idiot speaks, listen to them. When you've heard it all before, listen to them. You could be wrong. Now, don't listen to them for too long, but...
Right. And don't have such an open mind that your brain leaks out, like Carl Sagan is like to say, right?
Exactly.
These are important maxims,
But yeah, you're absolutely right to, stop at that point and say, yeah, there's a spectrum. And to some extent, it could be said that there is an aspect of dominance in all communication, that I am seeking to persuade people watching of certain ideas. But what I'm seeking them to persuade them of is not to dominate other people.
Right.
Not to trust authorities like me, not to trust Wikipedia necessarily, but to, as you say, on general subjects, it's extraordinarily good. If you look up the cult group pages on Wikipedia, they are actually rewriting them. So it's not, the commons approach to that is dangerous. You do at times need experts. You need people who actually know what they're talking about. But finding, being able to test authority and say, how much does this person know? The thing I really loved when I left Scientology was that I could challenge all of it. So, we'd got Adele Davis, let's eat right to stay stupid or whatever.
Right.
We find out when we research Adele Davis that she lost a court case very seriously because a young person had died because of following her advice. And it came out during that case that she did indeed hire a lot of researchers, but what they were meant to do was to find every paper published on a subject so she could list it at the end of her book. She didn't read the papers, and her advice was absolute nonsense. But in Scientology, it was a gospel. So it was lovely being able to come out and read a professor of nutrition's book about it, a guy called Bender, who was at one of the London schools, and then be able to read anything I liked, and to always say, if I feel passionately about something, I must read an opposing view. Now, recently, this last year, I've been reading about Holocaust denial because it fascinates me that anybody could believe that there was not a massacre of the Jews, the Romanis, the blacks, the communists under the Nazis in Europe. There are more witnesses to that. There's more evidence to that than any other event in history. There are over 100,000 witness testimonies, and they come from all sides. But last year, a friend of mine put forward the view that there had been no Holocaust, and so I went off and spent 3 days looking through. I went through this years and years ago, so I've got transcripts of Nuremberg, and I got all sorts of horrible things in my house that you wouldn't want to look at. I couldn't find my copy of the Skeptical Inquirer, which beautifully took it apart. So eventually, I ended up reading Michael Shermer and Grobman's book, Denying the Holocaust, which is pretty thorough. And, it's meant to be the great challenge. I can talk a Scientologist out of Scientology in a day. It's meant to be the most invasive cult. I've been told that, of the however many thousand there are, they're most difficult to deal with. Well, I have often been, I haven't done it for many years, but I got to the point where everybody I talked to, at the end of the day, and you only have a day, nowadays they've got cell phones so they can wander off on you. But at the end of the day, everybody I talked to over a 4 or 5 year period who didn't just leave the room screaming because I was Jon Atack, everybody I talked to decided that they didn't want to do it anymore. None of them joined the independents. None of them had any kind of collapse or, post-traumatic stress disorder. They just went, oh yeah. And when one of them, a TV crew, came to interview this guy, and I normally wouldn't allow any kind of access to somebody I'd talk to, but I talked to him first, and he said, "Yeah, I'm fine. I'll talk to them." He'd only been in for a few weeks, And the TV crew came and they said, "Right, okay. So what happened?" And he said, "Well, this guy came round, and we had a cup of tea, and we had a conversation, and I decided it was rubbish." And they went, "We're not filming you. Didn't he kidnap you? Didn't he beat you up? Didn't he?" So, but I got to that. But can I now get to the point where I can sit down with a Holocaust denier? Because what you're doing is it's not a conversation about facts and evidence. It's a conversation about culture. They are in a culture that says this is wrong. And they might be going, well, hollow means whole, coursed means burning. They weren't all burned. Which Mike Gard, I'm afraid, has recently put up a couple of days ago on his Facebook page. And it's like, yeah, if you look to the Oxford Dictionary, Mike, and I did, the word Holocaust meant the destruction of everything from the 17th century onwards. You don't have to burn it. And the evidence is overwhelming. But people go into a culture. I wrote a chapter for the Oxford University Press, along with Steve Hassan earlier this year. And it meant diving deep into the life of Dylan Roof, who walked into a church and shot 9 black people. And in his, bless the internet, his manifesto is called The Last Redemption, and it's still up there. No censorship on the internet. And well worth reading because it's quite short. Also did Elliot Rodger, and he published so much material. But Dylan Roof, you just got 9 pages, I think. And in it, he says that he's looked at websites and he's found that slaves actually preferred being slaves. They liked it. And I'm kind of going, look up the term a Derby dose, Dylan. I'm not going to say any more about what that is. And if you are squeamish, don't look it up. This was a practice used against slaves, and I don't think they liked it. Look at the photographs of the backs of whipped slaves, and try and convince me that the fantastic jazz performers, athletes, and academics who have come out of the Afro-American community, and indeed out of the African community and the Afro-British community, are not great genius musicians like Louis Armstrong and so many more, genius athletes like the Williams sisters, who happen to be Jehovah's Witnesses, by the way, or genius academics. And we've got to, it's a ridiculous nonsense, which is held up by a cultural view, not by, well, as I say, who would you rather believe, me or your own eyes? Getting people to be able to look at things and getting them to let go of the emotional attachment to their views, which is what causes the cognitive dissonance. There's a guy, I mention him often in Ken Burns Jazz, there's a white jazz critic who's about 70, and he says, I was a kid, I grew up in the Deep South, and he was taught that black people were a different species. And it's like, well, they're not a different species, we could interbreed. I'm afraid that's what a species is. So it's, sorry, that's wrong. But I was taught that they were sort of apes or something like this. What's this, the cross between the gorilla and the man? I mean, did the gorilla fancy the white man, or did the white man fancy the gorilla? It's hard to say. Just
so disgusting, the stuff he says.
And he said, one night he went into a club, he's a young man, and there was a man on the stage playing the trumpet, and he went, this is the only genius I've ever seen in my life. And that man was Louis Armstrong. And it's just, but people get into the culture where I was taught that, anybody who is not a member of the Mormons is sinful. Anybody who's gay is evil. That these set of rules and regulations, and we all the time need to be questioning those things, because that's the social brainwashing. That's the, you know, and I always come back to Eric Fromm, the great Eric Fromm, the wonderful Eric Fromm, Escape from Freedom, The Art of Loving, books that everybody should read, that he talked about people being life affirming or life denying. And we live in a society where nearly all of our leaders are narcissistically life denying. They only care about whether they're being adulated, and they stomp out of the room if people don't love them. Because as Eric Fromm says, Freud was wrong. It's not that they don't love anybody else, they only love themselves. It's that they don't know what love is. They don't love themselves. Like Ron Hubbard. Ron Hubbard would often go off and cry, really cry, because he'd not been adulated enough. I'm told that towards the end of his life, the only statistic he really cared about was how many minutes of applause there were to his picture at the end of an event. Oh, come on, that's so sad. You know?
It's pathetic.
Yeah.
It's pathetic. And that's an interesting point about love, by the way.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting point.
From his, he gives us so much. Malignant narcissism comes from Fromm. He's the first to talk. The pseudo-self, where people want other people to approve of them, and that's all they're trying to do, keeping up with the Joneses or what have you. That's Fromm. Brilliant.
And he's got some good points there, because that's very, very deep motivation for people.
Yeah.
And this word culture you're using, connected to cult, is brilliant, because we often use, you know, bubble world, you know, prison of belief, you know, echo chamber. You know, we talk about these terms, derogatory terms, all of them, but we are talking about a culture. I mean, exactly what you said. It follows all the rules.
Yeah, and there are cultures functioning within cultures and overlapping cultures, and you see a culture go wrong. I love the ideas in the Christian teaching about, you know, not hurting people and being considerate, you know, treat the golden rule, which of course originates in Buddhism 500 years before, but let's not worry about that. These are great ideas.
You know, if Jesus wanted to give it a microphone or a magnaphone, you know, megahorn or whatever, bullhorn, and shout that to the world, go right ahead.
Yeah, I have a lot more trouble with the idea that he came to set father against son. He came with a sword, that he came to separate the wheat from the chaff. And you know, my view is that it's rather than, you know, I hate that. I've heard a minister who got very angry with one of my friends because she said she preferred the King James Bible. And he said, this is the received word of God. We want the most accurate translation. I'm going, the received word of God. What we know historically, and this is a tangent, is that the book of Genesis, the earliest possible version for the Habiru, the Hebrew people, is 900 BC. It's just my nature. It's 900 BC. We've got Babylonian ring seals that are 1,500 years earlier that show the story of the Garden of Eden. And the goddess, using her agent, the serpent, invites humanity into the garden, which has date palms because the apple hadn't come from Afghanistan yet, to share of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. What is wrong about knowing about good and evil? So, you know, I mean, Yuval gets even quite savage about it. That if you look,
so do I. I have a very harsh critique of that entire philosophy, but I'm fascinated by its historical antecedents and what you just said. That's very, very interesting. I'm always fascinated by the history of a thing, the derivation of a thing. Maybe that came even from Scientology a little bit, because every single word I ever had to look up, I had to clear the derivation, right? The etymology.
Yeah, the etymology. I mean,
and you can dig into that.
I was doing that before I met Hubbard, so
yeah, I wasn't. You know,
recommend the History of Religion by Mircea Eliade. You know, Joseph Campbell's pretty good, but you know, has some interesting stuff. But Mircea Eliade was an incredible historian of religion who, his own life is phenomenal. At 14, he writes a book about entomology, insects. By the time he's 20, he's this is in the 1930s, he is a guru, a yoga guru in the Himalayas. He goes on to become a professor of religious studies at Chicago University. And he sews together this history. I mean, you can then get into the Masks of God, which is 500-page volumes by Campbell. But Eliade it's fascinating to go, oh, these are stories. And as Campbell says, mythology is not history, it's psychology. And it's where Dawkins and I disagree, because I think there is a great deal to be learned from religion, but you don't have to believe it. It can give you insight without believing it.
I agree with that.
Throwing away the bathwater with the baby, if you like.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I think at the end of the day, you can't lose with tolerance and compassion and understanding. You can't lose with it. You know what I mean? You personally, even if Jack,
without it.
Well, you can't live without it, but
you
also
can't win without it. You can't win without.
Well, yeah, exactly. Because even if the jackbooted thugs come, tearing down my door to kill me because I'm too compassionate or too tolerant or whatever, I've lived my life on my terms. And I chose kindness. I chose love. I chose to be kind to people and to tolerate people and to let people believe what they want and not, and sure, push back a little bit, talk about it, but I'm not gonna go lining people up against a stone wall and shooting them because they think something different than I do.
They tie their shoelaces the wrong way.
Okay. I don't understand that reference.
Well, it's just, how trivial does it have to be? I mean...
Oh, right. Yes.
Jonathan Swift, the greatest novelist in all history for me. Gulliver's Travels is the greatest novel I've ever read. And the idea that these two nations have been fighting because one of them break their boiled eggs at the top.
Oh, okay. Yeah, right.
They're called big enders, and the others at the bottom. And the movie, the one with Ted Danson, is actually a very accurate. All of the others forget them, but that movie really does capture the book and what Swift is talking about. That here's a man who understands cults and how it happens, and so he's got Brobdingnag and Lilliput, Laputa, all of these places. The rock floating in the air where the intellectuals talk to each other and have to be banged on the head to bring them back again. He understands the problem.
Exactly. Well, okay. Interesting stuff. Interesting stuff.
And watch my YouTubes.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, we're gonna wrap up. I hope you guys have enjoyed this out there. These long extended discussions are awesome for us, and I hope they're awesome for you guys. We have covered a lot of territory here, and we got into stuff I did not see coming at all, and I'm very, very happy we got into, because clarifying even for myself that business about Mary Sue, I've talked about that a little bit. I've always tried to say it was conjecture on my part. I'm very glad to get more input from you on that, because that helps clarify it even more. The position of nibs in the church, all of that history, as well as to talk about Excalibur. I mean, we talked about a lot of Scientology stuff in the middle of all of this, and appropriate to the whole concept of brainwashing, actually. So, there you go.
And Hubbard was a great believer in brainwashing and tried to sell it to John F. Kennedy, as I said, so.
Exactly. So, all right, where exactly can people find you on YouTube? How do they find you?
Jon Atack, Family and Friends. And,
excellent. Okay, so Google that, look that up on YouTube. I will post a link in the description section to this video and at sensiblyspeaking.com when this podcast posts. So you guys can click on that and get right to Jon's YouTube channel. I would also, do you have a blog, website, or anything like that they should go to?
Well, I was with the Open Minds Foundation from its inception, and so most of the content of the site and about 120 of my blogs are to be found there. And of course, I've written a bunch of books.
Exactly, and we'll put a link to the Opening Minds book.
To give you all of those. I would love it if people would actually go off and read my novels, because they're as discursive as this conversation.
Excellent. Well, why don't you send me a link to one of them, and I'll put that in the description section.
But there are only two that need to go up there at the moment. I've got 3 more that will be coming out soon, but I'll get Spike to send
Yeah, send me those
lots
links.
of links,
Excellent.
which is, of
All
course,
right,
the
man.
common word for left.
Good. Well, thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure and a privilege always, Chris.
Awesome, man.
Yeah.
You're just so awesome. All right, guys, any questions, comments, or feedback out there, leave them in the comment section here on YouTube or at sensiblyspeaking.com. I truly hope you have enjoyed this talk as much as we did and got something out of it. That was the whole point, was just try to help. And we'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.